Hello everyone. Is this mic on? Yeah, it's on. Oh, sorry everyone. Hello, my name is Cruz Summers, traditional name Gurman, given to me by my Kamingan, my grandfather, meaning kangaroo old man. I'd like to pay respects to Dagara, God, and all the Nguru, the spirits that govern the law, L-O-R-E law, of the land, nature, people, and of all things. I'd also like to pay respects to all elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm a proud Yugara and Bidra man, and take great pride in my culture, roles, and responsibilities passed down to me by my Kamingan and all my knowledge-bearing elders. I'd like to give thanks to my Kamingan, Douglas John Long, traditional name Baragan, meaning messenger boy, also meaning boomerang, for thinking me worthy of such roles, which I'll take with the humble heart, and take a lot of pride in. I'd also like to pay respects to all neighbouring tribes, and I'd like to pay respects to everyone that's here tonight, and respect to whatever land you come from. I'd also like to pay respects to some of my forefathers, Billimbar, Pop Bungary, King Billy, King Coolum, King Jackie, King Dalapai, and my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Mulpajo, headman of the Yugara people. I'd also like to say, Yarbareng Ngari Yanari, Yari Marumba Pigi Bujarang Gurangnem, Ngabangingili Gurman, Ngarba Nyarni Pura, Ngari Yari Brang Oibenangu, Nilpolagag Ngarba, Demangali Gungil, Yaru Yani, Yiba Marumba, Walara Marumba Dunga Demangali Gungil, Yo Maramarumba Nguru, you way. And in English that means, first I say, good day, beautiful people, come along, sit down, kangaroo old man, my name. I say now truth for the purpose of you here, my sacred land. Go, walk good, talk good to sacred land, yes, give good spirit. Farewell, Yalway.
Thank you, Cruz. Today, Marama Biji Baby, Kanagan, Kanan, Deba Mamba, Nanka Yagara Toma, Kanagan, by Malagai, Yugara Dagan, Yawai. What I say, what good evening, all, ladies and gentlemen, everyone up sky. We are the Yugara Dancers. We acknowledge our Yugara people here. Thank you, Cruz. Our Yugara family, the Long family. Yeah, and no video recording, please. That's how we like it. We don't like video recording, our dancers. We are just a family dance group from Ipswich. We just like being in a community. Just little communities like this, that's what we like dancing to. Yeah, we create our own song and dances, and that's how we just like doing, being family, and yeah. So yeah, like I said, all the dances we're doing tonight, we created on our own personal stories, our camping and that, acknowledge Demon Creek Mission and Perkin Mission, yeah. But this first song and dance we're doing, we're calling out the ancestors, acknowledge them for they are, and go and let you know that we are the Yugara peoples. Yahweh, acknowledge our ancestors. Thank you. Okay. Go. Thank you for your applause. Too kind. Sorry. You? No, not really. No. This next song is Deben. It's a mosquito dance that acknowledges Demon Creek Mission there in Ipswich, where all the people were forced upon. It's to acknowledge everyone who were forced there back in the days. Yeah, we really felt for them, so it's all for them. And back in the days when the Debianoia people, when they sit around the campfire, they usually grab the leaves from the eucalyptus tree, put it on the fire, so all the smoke, keep away the annoying Debins. Well, you see them grab the leaves and swish them away, how annoying they are. So yeah. This one, dedicated Demon Creek Mission. The mosquito, Debin. Hey! Yahweh. Yahweh, yeah. When I was yelling out Millen, that means plenty, lots of mosquitoes. When I was yelling out Yala, it means go away, you annoying things, yeah. This next one is Jurong Pili. It means rain coming. It's dedicated to the rain. This one came about when I was out camping with the cuz, out in the bush there. This was almost drought time. Everything was dry creeks, dry grass, dry trees, everything was just dry, it was drought time. And when I was camping there, yeah, it just started raining one day. And I was really happy for the rain, for all of us to drink, all the animals, fill up the creeks, green grass, green leaves. And I really felt happy for the rain to be with us. And I thought, oh yeah, I might create a song and dance to acknowledge the rain, how important in life we need it. So I went home and told the daughter here, who was 15 at the time. So I got another song and dance for the troop, just acknowledge the rain. And so daughter said, oh, I'll take care of it, Dad. So what daughter came up with, you see the dancers going out acknowledging the rain. You see them Jamanu go down with the water, thirsty. You see Dundaba washing themselves after a hard day out hunting and foraging, wash the bubbers and that. Then at the end you see them Yugara Dancers swimming, and they fill up the creeks, have fun at the end of the day, yeah. So acknowledging the rain. Yurang. Yahweh. Yeah. When I say Yahweh under the dance means I'm saying thank you to you. So I'll hand it over to Gabby here, the famous Wirrinyah for did solo. Thank you. Give the dancers the rest. Brother. I love that sound, yeah. This next one's Debal, the eagle. It's one of our totems on our grandmother's side, and we just wanted to acknowledge the eagle, how much we love it. And we always see it out on country when we're working, when we're swimming, camping. We've just been out on country, we always see that eagle flying around, and we love him so much. And so I thought, I might create a song and dance, so we acknowledge the eagle, yeah, one of our grandmother's totems. So yeah, the eagle, Debal. What's Yahweh mean again? Today, yeah. This next one's Billara. It's a spear dance. After the Devon Creek mission was closed down, our peoples were forced down the road to Perga mission, which means meeting place. Yeah, and when we were there camping one time, me and the young son went down to the creek there, looked for young straight gum trees to make billows for the dance troupe. Yeah, before we cut it down, said sorry to the tree, and thank you, brother. Yeah, when we cut it down, took it back to the camping place, debarked it, and put out the fire to hard and straighten. While I was doing that, I said, hey son, let's create a song and dance about us making spears, what have people done for a long time, yeah. So it's one of my special ones, of the very first song and dance I created. And I created it on my sister's birthday though. So yeah, go on and look for spears. Blah. Okay. Yahweh. Yeah, like I said, we're just a family dance troupe, just like being in the community. Oldest brother here in the Wirrinyah, myself, Henry. My son gets up and dances as well. My daughter there, Lakota Moon. Young sister there, Lorraine. Her two sons jump up as well. Mother, younger sister, her daughter, Leonie. Leonie's the director of the dance troupe. Says she's the boss. Says she's the boss. And nephew there, Christopher, on our Sandy family. So we're just a family dance troupe. We love being in the community. So thank you. Kookaburra? Okay. This next one's Kakarum, the Kookaburra. Yeah. This one's out camping with our cousin again out in the bush. Sit around on the campfire, talking, having a cup on that. And the cousin said, you hear that Kookaburra calling out early in the morning? I said, yeah, I heard him, cuz. So that's his job, to call out to wake up all the animals to go and forage for the day and get their food and mark the territory and all that. They said, hear him late in the afternoon. I said, yeah, I heard him. So that's his job. Till all animals go back to sleep before somewhere safe because the night animals coming out. When my cousin told me that story, he said, oh, there's a song and dance there, cuz, can I use him? He said, yeah, go on, you're right. So yeah, when we go dancing practice in the parks, local parks in Ipswich, this is what we come up with. Yeah, dedicated to Kookaburra. Kakaram. Waka Waka. Hey, Kakaram Gaga Kakaram Gaga Sasas. Kakaram Gaga Kakaram Gaga Sasas. Kakaram Gaga Kakaram Gaga Sasas. Hey, Waka Waka Kakaram, Waka Waka Kakaram. 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 Kakaram Gaga Kakaram Gaga Sasas. Kakaram Gaga Kakaram Gaga Sasas. Kakaram Gaga Kakaram Gaga Sasas. Waka Waka, hey! Yeah, why? So, we'll give the dancers a little rest now, and we're going to get used to stand up, do a dance first, okay? Everyone stand up. Come on out. Yeah. So when we go out to do dances now, we do workshops at kindergartens and daycares, and like shows like this. We go and do, we sing in the Yugara language, head, shoulder, knees and toes. So we're going to have a little practice first. We're going to go Majel, everyone Majel. Shoulders, kicker, knees, bone, feet, jinna. One more time. Majel, kicker, bone, jinna. One more time. Majel, kicker, bone, jinna, bone, jinna. Hey. And then we're going to go eyes, ears, mouth and nose. If you get lost, watch the dances, okay? Eyes, mil. Ears, benang. Mouth, tambu. Nose, muru. Mil, benang, tambu, muru. Mil, benang, tambu, muru. Tambu, muru. Hey. Then back to head, shoulder, knees and toes. Majo, kicka, bona, jina. Majo, kicka, bona, jina. Majo, kicka, bun, jina, bun, jina. Hey. And everyone, at the end, all big eagle wings out. Remember, girls, watch when the girls do their shake a leg. Aye. And the boys, do your shake a leg like nephew here. Aye. I'm going out, bun, jina. Hey, at the end, okay? Big yell at all of you, okay? So if you get lost, watch the dance here. So in the Yugara language, head, shoulder, knees and toes.
You could do it.
1, 2, 3, go! Majo kicka bona jina. Majo kicka bona jina. Majo kicka bun jina. Bun jina. Hey! Mil benang tambru muru. Mil benang tambru muru. Mil benang tambru muru. Hey! Majo kicka bona jina. Majo kicka bona jina. Majo kicka bun jina. Bun jina. Hey, eagle wings. Aye. Bun jina. Hey! Today, everyone. Too awesome. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. So, thank you for that. Too deadly. Our last song and dance is Good or Bang, about the brown snake. This one's special to us because it's dedicated to our grandfather. This one's another pilgrimage story. When we're there camping, watching the lovely sunset in the afternoon with a cup of tea. We'll talk about the dangerous snakes we see there. And Good or Bang, the brown snake got mentioned. And then Sister there, Lorenzo's grandfather, told us a story about the brown snake. I said, oh yeah, I was looking for a snake dance for the troop. And so that's why we'll create one and acknowledge it to our grandfather, Yunapin. So, the brown snake, Good or Bang. Garabana yorampen garabanda yorampen garabana yorampen garabanda yorampen garabana yorampen garabanda yorampen garabanda yorampen garabanda yorampen garabana yorampen garabanda yorampen garabana yorampen garabanda yorampen Garabanda European, Garabanda European, Garabanda European, European, hey, Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Just one more thing, I guess, before we get the night underway. An important protocol in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture is our sorry business. So if I'd just like everyone to stand for a moment's silence with the current sorry business that's in place for Yugara people. Thank you. I'd like to start off by, first of all, acknowledging and thanking the Yugara Dancers and my cousin brother Cruz for grounding us in the culture of the land, the Yugara and the Yugara people, the traditional custodians of this place. As visitors to this place, we have a responsibility, once we've been welcomed to country, to the place of their cultural responsibility, we have a responsibility to acknowledge that welcome that the custodians have given. So from myself personally, I would like to thank the Yugara Dancers, and from everyone I'm sure within here today, we would like to thank the Yugara Dancers and Cruz for that welcome, for that special grounding in culture of this place. So my name is Germaine Paulson, and I'm a Mununjali man, and I'm quite honoured to be asked to MC here tonight. To bestow the knowledges of our old people, of the practices that our old people used on country within land management, using the knowledges of our speakers tonight, to bestow that knowledge, to continue it with everyone here tonight. Just some general housekeeping. In the case of an emergency, we have the exits to the back, and the toilets are out to the foyer. I'd really, from the bottom of my heart, like to thank Boona Landcare. This is quite a groundbreaking event in my eyes, to have so much knowledge and so much given to us as people. So for the efforts of Boona Landcare to be able to bring this all together for a rural place of our homes, to be able to have all this knowledge in one space and to be able to take those practices back into our homes and to really regenerate land in a way that brings fulfilment to us all. Very much a big thank you to everyone involved in Boona Landcare for bringing, as I said, I think it's quite groundbreaking that we have so much knowledge in one place at one time. I'd also like to acknowledge Sydney Crim Shire Council for the use of the facility tonight, and for our councillors and everyone that's turned up tonight. We have a big evening planned. I'm sure everyone doesn't want to sit here and listen to me tonight, but we do have a big evening planned tonight. Each speaker is probably going to speak throughout 15 to 20 minutes. If you hear a bell, it's not an alarm, we're not evacuating. It's just a warning signal for our speakers. As I do, I'm sure they could speak all day on their love for country and how we can look after country. So it's just a warning for our speakers that their time's coming to an end. So if you hear a little bell, that's all that is. It's nothing for us to be alarmed at. There will be a short break at the completion of all our speakers. So I encourage everyone through our listenings to take all that in, but at the end we will have time, we'll have a little break, and we'll come back in and we'll reconvene for some questions at the end. So please, through all your listenings tonight, we'll listen up and we'll come back in, and then we'll pose the questions to our speakers then. So as I said, we do have a bit of an all-star cast here tonight. So without further ado, I won't sit here talking everyone's ear off. We'll get the knowledge holders up here tonight. And let's get on with our evening. So our first speaker that we do have, that we're quite honoured to have here tonight, is Mr. Leeton Lee. So Leeton is a Thungutty, Bundjalung, Amur man. Leeton is employed by Fire Sticks Alliance as the South East Queensland Fire Coordinator. And within that role, it's Leeton's job to go out and empower our custodians to be back on country, healing country, and he's Leeton out there, he's training our mob in fire practitioners. So I'd like to call Mr. Leeton Lee up as our first speaker.
Evening. So we've got a big crowd tonight. You've all come in from the heat wave. My name's Leeton Lee, Thungutty Bundjalung Wild Man, and as Germaine mentioned, I'm employed with Fire Sticks Alliance within this region. The first thing I just want to do is work out how this works. There we go. Is just acknowledge country, and thank you, brother, for the welcome before. Something that connects us everywhere that we go is people in the landscape, and I'll talk a little bit about that more tonight, is just that connection, but also to acknowledge Dr. Musgrave and Dr. George and the work of Victor Stephenson over the last 3 decades in an attempt to preserve and restore cultural fire knowledge across landscapes and get that back into communities, into regions across Australia. Also want to acknowledge all the many, many different regions and places that we work with. This work wouldn't be possible without the consent of traditional owners and the willingness for people to actually pick up and get back out there, out on country. So who we are, Fire Sticks Alliance is a reasonably young organisation, but the work's been happening, as I said, for about 3 decades. We work to empower communities to bring back their cultural fire. When we talk about cultural fire, it's not all the same. And that's a really, really important thing to remember, that it's very place-based and it's about people. People are a big part of that. The language, the story, the foods and medicines, and the movement of people is a really, really big part of that for a lot of our indicators. So a lot of our work, as I said, is working with traditional owners to empower, heal and protect a lot of our landscapes and provide a resilience there on the landscape, which also in turn, does things like reduces hazard and protects areas as well. We've got coordinators based across Australia, so Tasmania to South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, up to the wet tropics. And when I was putting this slide together, I really wanted to acknowledge this photo here. This is actually part of history in the making. So this is one of our first cultural fire workshops for our South East Queensland mentoring program, which will be on the next slide. But we have an amazing group of up-and-coming fire practitioners who will be out there in regions across southern Queensland doing all of this work. Not only the work, but being able to practice the knowledge and the culture again. We'll talk a little bit more about why that hasn't been the case for so many years. But it's really, what was the word you used before? Groundbreaking. It's groundbreaking, I like that. But it's something that in the next couple of years, my hope is to see people out there doing this stuff everywhere. This about the mentoring program is, we have 25 to 30 cultural fire practitioners coming through this program, which looks at different country types and ecosystems and the timings and indicators. And there's a lot of knowledge sharing, not only between fire sticks and the different fire practitioners coming through, but also with the participants themselves. I sit back a lot and actually just listen to a lot of the yarns that happen, and everywhere that we go, and I can hear the conversations and the connecting. Oh, thank you. I can hear the conversations and people connecting about stories, language, foods. Oh, what do you use that for? Yeah, no, we use that for that too. Did you know you could use it for this? All of this knowledge sharing and relationship building is something that's really healing, not just for the land, but for people as well. Identity. I put 3 exclamation marks there. It's pretty important. When we're having a look at the identity, what I'm talking about is our ecosystems and the identity of the landscape, and that's always place-based. So we have what we refer to as gum country, ironbark country, spotted gum country, stringy bark country, sandridge country, coastal heath country, wetlands, riparian areas. So we've got all these different systems that sit as far as identity, and the identity of the land is much the same as people. We all have our own place of origin. We have our own language in a lot of places. We have our own foods and unique things that are unique to us, the way that we look. The land is no different. The relationship between people and the land has been going on for thousands and thousands of years, and it's only through people that the landscapes here in Australia have been shaped, and shaped to deal with fire or shaped to keep fire out. Throughout that relationship, there's a I can never say the word, reciprocity, where we're looking after those different places, and the land is looking after us in return. You have a look at any gardens or yards or parks, they're maintained. Our old people were not just hunters and gatherers, they were harvesters, farmers, gardeners, doctors, builders, many things on our landscapes. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a hard time seeing some of my notes there. When we're talking about traditional knowledge and cultural burning, it's absolutely impossible for people to be able to do it without the local people leading it, because, as I mentioned before, everything is place-based. It has a story. There's a DNA connection between the landscape and the people. We're talking about medicines not too long ago, and we were talking about, where to get the best medicines. And it came up in conversations, the best place to get your medicines is from your own country, because we are connected to that. Much in the same way, when we're talking about seeds and distribution of seeds and things like that, it should be place-based. The ironbark trees that we have growing in this region are specific, and they've evolved with this landscape here in this region. So if we pull plants out from other places, they're adapted and evolved for a different place with a different climate, a different average rainfall, different average temperatures. So it's really, really important that we're able to maintain a lot of those systems. Those systems were maintained by a couple of ways: with fire and through the use of harvesting. When we're using fire, there are so many things that need to fall into line before we even consider putting any fire on the ground. We're having a look at a lot of our seasonal indicators. What's happening with the birds? Are the birds nesting? Are the possums nesting? Are there animals breeding? are we just about to burn our food source? So we're talking about burning for food, we're burning about talking, we're talking about burning for the health of a lot of other things that are around us. So for production of honey, if we're burning the wrong fires, we kill all of our native bees. And honey is a prized thing to have on your country, honey. We put all these things into place, and much the same, our soils. Our soils are all different. We've got black soil, red soil, light soil, clay soil. We've got sandy country. We've got all these different soils that the same as the trees and flowers and the animals and the people, they all have their own requirements and their own needs. So there's a whole heap of things that need to line up when we're talking about what is cultural burning. It's a practice. It has to include the people, and it has to be beneficial for everything. So we can't just go and we're going to go burn for this animal or this plant. We're looking at everything. And when we're looking at putting fire on landscapes, we're not just looking at hazard and risk and safety and things like that. We do consider safety, but everything has to benefit. If there's something that's not going to benefit from that fire, then we have to have a look at what that is and what needs to be done. We do have a changed landscape now where we have invasive natives on our landscape that were never here hundreds of years ago. Oh, wrong button again. This is, I've taken a couple of images just off the internet because I don't do land clearing. So with management that's changed over the last couple of 100 years and the removal of the people from the landscape, management and practices have changed over time. And this is a practice that we would never see 250 years ago and beyond. Some of the issues that we're now having and seeing on our landscapes are partly because of this, land clearing and these stack piles. You'll hear a little bit later on about soil health and what extreme heats does to a lot of our soils, but it's also when we're removing the right fire from our landscapes, it's also affecting our water quality and our waterways and causing erosion and a lot of these things. We've had in a lot of areas where fire has been excluded as a traditional land management practice, where we are seeing a lot of this sort of stuff all over. You can drive in any direction for an hour and see it somewhere in some capacity. One of the big things that we're losing, especially with a lot of this sort of stuff, is our elders. So when I say our elders, I'm talking about the elders on the landscape. Much the same as our elders in our communities are very, very important, the elders on our landscape are just as important because they're the same ones that keep all of the younger growth and they keep order and balance and bring in the right vegetation. How many of you have seen the images from the timber getters from in the last couple of centuries and the size of some of the trees that were cut down? Some of those trees were thousands of years old. They were the true elders on the landscapes. A lot of our bigger trees that we see now are only really just teenagers going into young adulthood. If we had everybody in Boona was 17, what would that look like? You're all laughing because you know they'd be running amok. And nobody'd be doing anything and everybody'd be, running amok. That's much the same as what's happening on a lot of our landscapes now, is with clearing, a lot of the vegetation all coming up, it's all coming up the same age. There's no elders on the landscape to, I guess, guide and make sure that things are happening with the right balance. Everything's competing. And there'll be some images that I can show and speak to with that. I'm just going to move away from the microphone for a bit because I actually want to point it out. So there's a lantana plant here, which I passed coming back through Cubby Cubby country last year, I think it was. This lantana's 7 metres high. That's the flowers up there. That's the flowers up there. So much the same as a lot of our native species have been evolving with our landscape, some of our invasive species are also evolving to climb, which is a pretty scary thought. But how do we control lantana? We can use fire. Fire is probably one of the best tools that I've seen for lantana. In the photo on the left was from a fire that we had done, and you could see even before the fire had even passed, that lantana was dead. Is that the 5 minutes or the 1 minute? 5, okay. Whoa. The flammability of a lot of our species that are becoming invasive on our landscapes is something that we're only just starting to see. If you look at what's happening out at Millmerran and to the southwest right now, we're seeing a glimpse of a lot of things to come. So this was an image taken where a lot of our invasive natives are coming through because there's been no fire. So this is actually bloodwood country, and as you can see, the dense thickening of brush box coming up, and it's actually gone and dropped leaves and broken down for so long, it's actually covered the sand. We were confused, we were like, what? We got bloodwoods here and we got these plants, and we had to actually dig down about that far to actually find the sand. So invasive natives are getting out of balance because of the absence of the right fire. This is an extreme outcome. This was actually out at Millmerran with the Queensland Murray-Darling catchment ranges and Beck from Millmerran Landcare. This place was devastated in 2019, 2020 from the wildfires that went through there. And as you can see, we've got vegetation. This is only a year after, vegetation this high, and you can't even walk through most of that. Look, it's like double clicking. We can reintroduce the right fire as management practices, and we've got so many benefits. So these are only to list a few. We can increase our soil health by putting the right temperatures in the soils from the right vegetation. We can increase and maintain diversity, which in itself will only allow for certain areas to burn at the right time of the year. Because everything had its own timing. When we put our fire in, it was either too green or recently burnt to burn. We can protect our towns, habitats, our water quality, and have a look at employment opportunities across the green economy. Now, the green economy is something that you will probably start seeing a little bit more about in the next couple of years, but it's using traditional knowledge to heal landscapes and create employment. If we invested the same into prevention and resilience and health of our landscapes, the same as we do for response, I think we'd be living in a pretty amazing place, even better than what we are now. At the moment, I sort of drive around and I see these big signs up, watch out for fire ants and things like that, but we're not actually putting enough of a lens on our landscape. Our landscape's slowly becoming an ecological desert in many places, and it's happening without a lot of us even realising what's happening. I guess the main point of the discussion and what I'm talking about here is around the relationships. For thousands of years, those relationships have included traditional owners and the land and the animals and the reciprocity that goes with that, the balance and the timing. We now have a whole heap of other people here to including that relationship process and how that works for everybody. And I think looking at the next decade, I think we're in a really, really exciting space to see just what we can do to actually restore a lot of our cultural landscapes, because our life and property is not just houses and buildings, it's everything. It's our trees, it's our grasses, it's our foods, medicines. It's all of these things that are really, really important to us, and they should also be very, very important to you, because that keeps a lot of the animals that are unique to only this continent here. And we have a lot of work to do. I did have a few jokes, but with my jokes, as dry as they are, they need their own fire danger system. So, but I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much for having me and for your attention.
Another big round of applause for Leeton Lee. It's important that we remember those holistic views of country, of land, when we are looking at land management. And it's also important to remember that we are conditioned as society to have a negative relationship with fire. We're taught from a young age that fire is dangerous, to be scared of fire. With the right fire, it can really help us move forward in regeneration of land, of country. Our next speaker is a retired researcher for CSIRO. He has over 30 years' experience as a research scientist studying the effects of fire management in natural landscapes of Northern Australia. Dr. Garry Cook has extensive experience also in his research, engaging with the traditional custodians of the Northern Territory. Introducing Dr. Garry Cook.
Thank you. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Yugara people and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I've been asked to speak on fire from the perspective of carbon. It's something I've spent 3 decades of my life working on, and you may be aware of the fire and greenhouse gas abatement projects across Northern Australia. They've been on TV and in various places, and took a long time getting up, but somewhere over a third of Northern Australia, now I'm talking about a third of the continent across the north, a third of that area is under fire burning projects to reduce greenhouse gases, and are getting funding out of the federal government's greenhouse gas abatement projects program to support improved land management. And for many Aboriginal communities, it's the only ongoing money they get for any land management project, and they're using it to be able to support lots of other land management work. Anyway, it's from that perspective that I'm coming. So in the talk today, why is the greenhouse gas effect relevant? I want to talk about the bureaucracy of carbon, bit of a boring subject, but very important if we're going to get funding for improved land management. I want to talk a little bit about the savanna burning work. So this is from a Northern Australian perspective, what, why, where and how. And then I want to talk about the relevance and raise some questions for South East Queensland. So I spent 30 years of my life living in Darwin, but I've now moved back to South East Queensland where I grew up, and interested in contributing as I can. Oh dear. Okay, why is fire an issue in this part of the world? Well, one reason is with global warming, we're seeing the fire weather in Australia steadily getting worse. We've published a paper in the last year looking at the history of the Forest Fire Danger Index across Australia over the last 40 years, and it's been steadily getting into worse and worse fire danger. And the consequence of that is more and more of the forest area is burning each year. Now this graph here shows it's the satellite era. So since 1988, when the Landsat satellite started monitoring burnt area, through to 2019. I don't think we've got the big 2019 fires in this, but you can see there the last decade or so, from about 2007, 2008, the area of forest in Queensland burnt in the September to December period, that's the peak fire time for this part of the world, has been increasing far above what it was for the previous couple of decades. And we've got Queensland Fire Service data going back much further in time that does suggest that this past decade or so has been significantly worse than previously. And even in the off-season, there's been a slight increase, but very significant compared to what it was before, of fire in forests in Queensland. Now, just a bit of background, there's several gases that trap the sun's heat, and it's the increase in these gases that is causing the global warming and putting more energy into the system and pushing the extremes to be greater. The overwhelming majority of the increase is coming from fossil fuel combustion, but there is certainly a bit of it coming from land management practices, land clearing, which converts trees into carbon dioxide when they're cleared and burnt. Carbon in the soil gets released when fields are ploughed. There's a steady decline in soil carbon over time, and they dominate. And if we're going to tackle the problem, that's got to be tackled. But there is an opportunity for land managers to increase the amount of carbon stored in the landscape, reduce the amount of greenhouse gases coming off from landscapes, and get money to do that. And that is the work that we did and applied in Northern Australia. So this is the bureaucracy bit. There's the federal government's carbon farming initiative, which allows land managers to earn carbon credits through changing land management practices, changing land use, and increasing the carbon storage or reducing the emissions. And the way this works is there's published methodologies. The two I've been involved with intimately are savanna fire management. Well, there is a savanna fire management and two aspects of that. One is about emissions avoidance, and that is about reducing the amount of smoke going up on average over years, and the gases in that smoke. And the other is about increased amount of carbon stored in the landscape. And in the savanna zone, this is principally about reducing the frequency of severe fires so that there's more logs left on the ground, more dead wood on the ground in standing dead trees, providing habitat and storing carbon in the landscape, so it's not burning and going up into the atmosphere. And it's those two things that are funding improved management of a third of Northern Australia and providing huge amounts of resources that Aboriginal people and other land managers did not have a decade ago to support land management. Now, part of the background to this, and we heard from Leeton the sad story of Aboriginal displacement from land. Now, in this part of the world, that led to a reduction in fire frequency. A lot of the land had fire excluded from it. In Northern Australia, right up the top of the Kimberley, the top end of the territory, up on Cape York Peninsula, what happened when Aboriginal people were pushed off the land is, as a consequence, we got very, very frequent late dry season fires. So this is the hottest and driest time of year, strongest winds, and any fire that started just kept burning till it hit the coast. So in that context, in Northern Australia, the projects were about trying to get people back managing country, back onto their land, and using fire cleverly to create burnt fire breaks in the landscape to reduce the frequency of big, severe, late dry season fires. And this had a whole range of other benefits for wildlife, etc. And I approached this as a scientist, and about 2 decades ago we started working with traditional owners from the Arnhem Land Plateau, and the old man we worked with from there was very keen on getting improved management on his country and getting the young people back engaged, out of town, out of trouble, back working on their land, using fire, learning all the traditional skills, learning their language as it related to land management. Different story down here, but many of the same principles apply. Now, this is a photo I used to illustrate what we're trying to achieve in Northern Australia. The photo on the right is what is typical from the extensive late dry season fires. Right, left. That side anyway. Everything gets burnt. The larger trees survive and regrow, but for quite a few months of the year after that fire, there's no cover, no habitat. Any small animals have got no shelter, they're going to get eaten. Feral cats love this sort of fire. They'll travel 15 kilometres to a patch burnt like this to clean everything up. On the other side of the picture, we've got a patchy early dry season fire. This sort of thing still leaves burnt fire breaks in the landscape that help prevent the spread of extensive large fires, but leave little bits of habitat, which from a carbon accounting perspective, little bits of unburnt carbon that I add up, but it's also habitat for animals to hide in. It's little spots where plants are recruiting. It creates a much healthier landscape. And a colleague, Sarah Legg, who's working for Australian Wildlife Conservancy, did work looking at the effects of what she called here a bad fire history versus a good fire history. Bad being frequent, non-patchy, extensive late dry season. Good is less frequent, more patchy fires. And the diversity of native mammals with the good fire history is greater, and the abundance of them, the number of them per hectare, was greater with the good fire history. Now, this is work I've been very intimately involved in. I talked about the emissions from fire. We've collected smoke coming off different types of fire, different fuel types, different grasses, different leaf litter, burning logs, measuring the gases in that smoke, cutting quadrats, little patches of fuel before the fire, after the fire, calculating how much is going up in smoke and how much of different gases is going up in smoke, and that's feeding into the national greenhouse gas accounts. So we can work out how different fire regimes are affecting the amount of greenhouse gases going off from the landscape. We're also interested in the amount of carbon stored principally in trees in the landscape, in live trees, how are they affected by different fire regimes, and in dead wood in the landscape. You'll notice, looking around the areas of bushland here, somewhere around 10 to 15% of the trees in any landscape are dead, and we're interested in how long they sit there as dead carbon stored in the landscape. From a carbon perspective, that's important. They're also very important as habitat, and logs lying on the ground are important. So we're very interested in dead wood dynamics. So how does this apply to southeast Queensland? And I'm afraid I'm using photos from over the border in New South Wales, but you get the picture. A key question is, what is the relationship between controlled burning and the risk of severe wildfire? And it's not straightforward. I was rather dismayed by some of the commentary during the big fires in 2019 into 2020. Controlled burning doesn't necessarily mean you won't get a severe wildfire. Under the most severe fire weather conditions, no matter what you've done, you can still get the fire being driven into the canopy. And down in Victoria, fires burnt across football ovals. So even with grass that short, they burnt. And with different controlled burning practices, you can actually not always, make the problem worse, because you get sudden recruitment of acacias that create a shrub layer that can stay there for a decade or so and create a ladder to carry fire up into the canopy. That sort of thing varies. It requires a lot of intimate knowledge of the landscape dynamics. We heard from Leeton about how particular the knowledge is to different places, and that's certainly the case here. And it's not only particular to different places, it's particular to different times, whether you're burning in a dry period or a wet period, or before a wet period or before a dry period. All of that feeds into how your controlled burning or cultural burning practices will affect the problem of the risk of a severe wildfire. It's something that varies in space with the landscape you're dealing with, whether it's westward facing or eastward facing, whether it's fairly flat land or sloping. Fires are more severe on sloping country than flat. And there's also the potential that you actually change the biome you're working in. You can convert a eucalypt forest into a rainforest, or backwards, depending on your fire management or severe fire weather. How do you measure this? That's 5 minutes. Okay. Well, from the perspective of carbon, we need to bring the bureaucracy along with us. It means a lot of sit-down, backroom meetings, boring stuff that just has to be done to help this continue to go along. And to get funding for land management, it requires a heck of a lot of legwork in that. It took us decades to get up the projects in Northern Australia. There's a lot we can explore in terms of fire management scenario using, desktop studies, and just trying to draw out from experts who know their field and their areas intimately, we can draw that knowledge out and get a long way ahead without actually doing anything new, just using existing knowledge. And then comes the job of measuring what is actually happening. And this requires really good baseline measurements of all sorts of things. From my perspective, I measure woodland dynamics, and we need to document the change into the future. And it's got to be targeted, not just collecting data for its own sake, it's got to be targeted to answering the key questions. Are your practices, well, how can we improve them to actually reduce the risk of severe wildfires? How we can improve them to help improve the habitat for animals and plants you might be particularly interested in. Now, in my days, I did that with a string and tape and a notebook and pen and wandered up and down miles of country measuring trees. It's a slow process and you can only get so much data. This is work from my colleague Sean Levesque, which is the future for this area. He's using a machine called a LiDAR, seen standing on the tripod there or on the roof of the car. And it creates, across hectares, square kilometres potentially of country, a 3D data cloud of every leaf, twig, blade of grass, stick in a landscape that can sit there on your computer and do some, you know, you can move through the landscape like this on your computer. So this, yep. This bit of woodland, this is just a bit outside of Darwin, exists there on the computer as a measurement of how it was when we did this, that we can go back and know intimately what it was like several years ago. The new machine he's got has even got better resolution than this, greater power. And then he can do things like this. Here's a patch of, small patch of trees in 2013, comparing it to the same image, or the same new images in the same area in 2017. The colours here are highlighting new growth that has happened over that 4-year period. A couple of new saplings there on the, whatever side that is for you, new growth on the tall tree there. Now that's looking at the new stuff. What has gone, there's been a couple of fires in that period. That's what's disappeared. The tall dead standing tree there burnt and was consumed. The other little saplings were burnt and consumed. Now, we used to try to do that with a string and tape and a notebook and pen. You know, Sean can do this now across hectares and square kilometres. You know, remarkable technology that, you know, it takes trained people and there's a lot of grunt goes in behind this. But it's a remarkable technology that is now being developed and applied. Could be very, very valuable for those interested in quantifying habitat change in this part of the world. Thank you.
Another round of applause for Dr. Garry Cook. Our next speaker is a lecturer in wildlife management at the University of Queensland Gatton campus. Her research group works on phyroecology and management from the perspective of plants and animals and the underlying genetic population structures. Dr. Annabel Smith has been working with the First Nations fire practitioners from Wirrinyah Conservation Services in the Lockyer Valley to understand how ancient burning practices affect habitat and wildlife. Dr. Annabel Smith.
Thanks, Germaine. Thanks everyone for having me. I was trained in a very Western science approach to the phyroecology of plants and animals, so I'm going to show you what that looks like and we can discuss the pros and cons of this in the discussion session. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting tonight, the Yugara, the Wurundjeri Burra and the Manajali people, and all those in the Yugambeh language group. Thank you, Cruz, for the very warm welcome. Thanks, Uncle Henry and the Yugara Dancers for the wonderful dancing. I'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty of this land was never ceded. So just a bit of background to myself. I've been living in southeast Queensland for about 3 years now. I grew up on Kaurna country, Adelaide, and I did my first major research project on Bundjalung country in South Australia. This is mallee woodland, so it's a semi-arid woodland, and I was working on the fire ecology of reptiles out there. Very diverse ecosystem. I lived for 6 years in Ngunnawal country, Canberra, where I was working, among other things, on grassland restoration. Then I spent 3 years in Ireland working on a single species of plant, Plantago lanceolata, that's native in Europe and it has spread all around the world. And then about 3 years ago, I arrived in Queensland to start my position at UQ, and I'm going to tell you a bit about some of my background work and some of the new research I'm doing with my students. So how is fire managed for plants and animals? Well, we can go straight to the Queensland Government website and have a look at the fire management guidelines for the different regional ecosystems in Queensland. And these guidelines state that they're based on quantitative and qualitative information from the published literature and expert observation and opinion. And what this has led to is fire management guidelines for most of the regional ecosystems in Queensland. So we can take a look at just one example here of an ironbark woodland, and we have fire management guidelines on the season in which to burn, the intensity at which to burn, the interval, and the strategy that it should be burnt at, and some of the issues. And this is available for the majority of regional ecosystems in Queensland. And we're very lucky to have this. Not all states and territories have fire management guidelines on this scale. However, the guidelines state that the draft guidelines are derived from the scientific literature, and due to the dearth of documentation of the effects of fire on many of our ecosystems, a panel of relevant professional experts in each bioregion are consulted. So first of all, we don't have a lot of information on plants and animals. And it's also worth pointing out that these professional experts usually come from a Western science perspective as well. So there's not a lot of Indigenous knowledge incorporated into those. So how would we, in an ideal situation with quantitative information, predict how plants and animals might respond to a certain fire regime? We can look at one example where they've actually done this for a single species of plant, Leucopogon stiger. It's an obligate seeder. So it's killed by fire and it regenerates only from seed. So it's very sensitive to the frequency of burning. And these researchers were able to predict how frequent a fire would lead to its greatest abundance in the landscape. But what did they need to do that? They actually needed really detailed data on survival, fecundity, post-fire recruitment, dispersal. They needed data on fire regimes, contemporary fire regimes and climate regimes, and future fire predictions. And then there's a whole complicated modelling process then that has to come before that can be used to make it available for fire management planning, just for one species. So this is great. In an ideal situation, we could do this for all species and have a good idea of how they respond. But that detailed level of information is rarely available for most species, and it can take years or decades to produce this kind of data. And often, most of the data in these guidelines come from plants, assuming that the animals will just follow when the appropriate plants come back. So, but what about animals? Is that the case? And fire ecologists for a very long time assumed that animals would respond when their appropriate habitat recovered after fire. And this became known as the habitat accommodation model, which showed that as habitat complexity changed with time since fire, Different animals would come back at different times, depending on what kind of habitat they needed. And you'd see all these different relationships, like one species might increase as habitat complexity increases, another might decrease because it benefits from this recently burnt area. And then you can get these hump-shaped relationships. So you get all these different relationships based on habitat. The problem was, though, that this often didn't work. So we couldn't always predict when animals would respond based on their habitat. And some people came to know this as the field of dreams hypothesis, that when you build it, they will come, or when the habitat grows back, the animals will come back. So a lot of my research on reptiles then was looking at what other factors are involved other than habitat in what makes an animal species respond to changes in its habitat after fire. And I focused on this little guy, the knob-tailed gecko, or Nephreus stellatus, very cute little gecko, and it has this really interesting fire ecology in that it goes through a population boom after fire. It really is the most abundant at about 10 to 15 years after fire in mallee vegetation. Then it declines in abundance. So if you go out in long unburnt mallee, these guys are very hard to find. So I wanted to look at the biological traits that influence this species' fire response. And some of the things I found were that survival changed as the habitat changed. And this seemed to be offset by a change in reproductive rates. So we had lower survival in the very early years after fire, but very high reproductive rates. So almost all of the female geckos I caught in that recently burnt area were pregnant. So they're going through this population boom, even though survival rates are lower, probably because of predation in that open habitat. I found there was a slight decline in the distance that they moved per day in the long unburnt habitat. So the habitat complexity might be restricting their movement. And this led to a decline in genetic diversity with time since fire. And this is important for things like the adaptive potential of species. I also found that their physiology changed with time since fire, and this was related to their invertebrate abundance. These guys eat insects and invertebrates, and I found that where invertebrate abundance was higher in recently burnt habitats, the geckos, particularly females, tended to be more healthy. So this allowed us then to get some ingredients into how we might predict fire responses in animals, not just based on their habitat. So we found reproduction was very important, dispersal and movement were very important, genetic diversity, and also food availability and species interactions. And these kind of data can be integrated into multi-species models to look at how the whole community changes with different fire regimes. This kind of recipe, I guess, has kind of formed as a guide for where I want to take my research in future. So I'd just like to now tell you about 3 projects that I've been working on with my students where we've been targeting some of these ideas. So we'll look at species interactions, dispersal and movement, and genetic diversity. So to begin with, I have a PhD student, Felicity Charles, who's really interested in this idea of the role of fire in plant-animal interactions. Felicity is in the audience tonight, so you can go and talk to her about this later. But she's really interested in the glossy black cockatoo, because these birds only eat she-oaks. So among about 78 she-oak species, glossy black cockatoos feed on about 12 she-oak species. And we know that she-oaks have a really interesting fire ecology. Some of them are obligate seeders, some of them are re-sprouters. So how we manage fire then, and how this is going to affect the feed trees, is then, of course, going to affect glossy black cockatoos. So Felicity is in early stages of her project, but she's been collecting data on she-oak regeneration in recently burnt areas and longer unburnt areas across a fire frequency gradient in Yugara country. And she predicts, and we predict, that the obligate seeders will have a stronger response to fire frequency, because how frequently the ecosystem is burnt is really important for them developing seeds and regenerating. Whereas the re-sprouting species will likely have a flatter response. Giving you an example of research on movement and dispersal as it relates to fire. This is my student Rhiannon Bird, who did some work for her honours project looking at how mammal species change in rainforest areas that had been affected by the 2019-2020 wildfires. This is actually just down the road in Main Range National Park, where the rainforest doesn't typically burn at very high intensities, but there some of these rainforest margins actually were affected by these fires. So we were really interested to know, are the mammal communities in these rainforest margins regenerating like a sort of intact rainforest, or were they responding more like the surrounding eucalypt vegetation? So Rhiannon set up camera traps in unburnt rainforest, burnt rainforest, and burnt eucalypt forest surrounding that area. And what she found was that there were two species in particular that had much higher probability of occurrence in the unburnt rainforest. So these were like rainforest specialist species that were actually affected both in the burnt rainforest and the burnt eucalyptus forest by the fire. This led to an overall decline in the number of mammal species that we caught in the burnt rainforest. And one of the interesting things that Rhiannon did during her project was categorise their activity. So we know that animals, when they feel safe, if they're in a safe environment, they tend to show behaviours such as grooming, feeding, but if they're in an unsafe environment, they might have a heightened probability of activity. So Rhiannon classified the animals into whether they were active or inactive. And she found one species, the fawn-footed melamies, did show an interesting response. Where deeper into the rainforest, they appeared to be more active, so kind of going against our hypothesis. But then this strange sort of decline deeper into the burnt sclerophyll. So that didn't really match our hypothesis about animals feeling safe. But it was an interesting aspect to her project that was a little bit different to look at their actual behaviours. And finally, I just wanted to give an example of our work on how fire might affect genetic diversity in plant species. This was a collaboration with Jennifer Fern at QUT and one of my students, Binyan D, who worked on the analysis for this project. And we were really interested in this buffel grass that you all might have heard of. It's a very invasive grass that grows throughout central Australia. And fire is frequently used, especially along roadsides, to control its biomass. Now, we all know, because in Australia here we see this all the time, that fire is a really important evolutionary driver of plant traits. So we see things like post-fire seedling germination, serotiny, where the seeds are held in hard cones, post-fire resprouting, and thick bark that can protect trees from low-intensity fire. And there's evidence now that even these kinds of evolution of fire-adaptive traits can even occur on short ecological timescales. So we also know that, let me just check I didn't miss one. Yep, we also know that invasive plant species can rapidly adapt to new environments. And some of the work I did on Europe touched on this, where we looked at environmental gradients and how genetic diversity responded to the environment in the native and non-native range of Plantego lanceolata. And we found there was this strong relationship to these environmental gradients in its native range, but not in its non-native range. So where it's invasive, it has higher genetic diversity, probably higher adaptive potential, and it doesn't really care where it grows. It can grow across a whole range of habitats. So, does fire then influence genetic diversity in invasive plants? And could this give them a selective advantage if fire's managed in the wrong way? That was the question, and we sampled 11 sites in Central Australia at burnt roadside areas and compared them to unburnt areas a little bit further away. And what we found was that we found 3 genetic groups in about 90 samples that we collected. That's shown there by the colours, these 3 distinct genetic lines. But there was no relationship with whether the sites had been burnt or unburnt. So we didn't see any genetic structure that was related to fire. Nor did we see any genetic diversity patterns that were related to fire. So We didn't find in this case that fire was affecting genetic diversity. We know it can in other systems. So we think roadside burning can continue to be used appropriately to manage biomass in this species. But we're also really interested in how this might happen in both native and invasive plants, because it can affect their evolutionary potential. So I just want to end then by talking about a review paper that I did with a bunch of fire scientists from around the world with expertise in a whole range of different areas, and we were interested in how fire was affecting biodiversity globally. So we know that inappropriate fire regimes are caused by climate change, land use change, invasive species, and reductions in Indigenous burning regimes. And what we found was we actually categorised species in the International Union for Conservation Red List that had been classified as threatened, and we found that inappropriate fire regimes were recorded as a threat for at least 15% of the 29,000 species that were recorded as threatened. So in other words, the wrong type of fire was threatening over 4,000 species with extinction around the world. So this is a global issue. We have big problems about this with this in Australia, but also around the world as well. And that review led us to develop a series of guidelines around what we need to do differently. And of course, so important in this list is the reinstatement of Indigenous burning and cultural burning. So I think some of these frameworks, these Western science frameworks, are pretty good, but so often we don't have enough data and they're not being implemented at the scales that we really need them to be. So we definitely need to be doing things differently, and I'm really happy to be here tonight and be part of this discussion. Thanks everyone for having me, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Annabel. Another big round of applause. As a society, as we move forward in our push for regenerative land management practices, it's becoming even more evident that soil health is the main pillar in a sign of a healthy land system. Our next speaker is a senior lecturer at the University of Southern Queensland School of Agriculture and Environmental Science. Dr. Kate Reardon's interest in sustainable land management includes the impact of management on soil and vegetational health. As a member of the UQ ecology team, she is particularly interested in understanding how vegetation and soil fungal communities respond to the different types of fire in the landscapes and what this means for land managers. Everyone, a big round of applause for Dr. Reardon-Smith.
Thank you. You're right, Leeton, it's hard to see. Okay, I'm just going to go back. Right, fire and soils. I'll start by saying I'm not a soil scientist, I'm an ecologist, but obviously, as we've just discussed, soils are an incredibly important part of what happens in terms of vegetation responses to fire. And we're more and more understanding also the complexities of the changes that occur in soils under different fire regimes. So I want to start by, I won't be able to read it all. The University of Southern Queensland obviously sits on a number of campuses. So our main campus in Toowoomba is Guyabal and Jarrawa country. The Yugara, Yugara and Yugara people of Springfield and Ipswich are people that we acknowledge and recognise as well. The Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, Sydney, where we also have a campus, a small campus, sorry. And the Cumberwell people of Stanthorpe as well. So we acknowledge and honour all of those traditional owners of the countries on which we work and teach and share our experiences. We acknowledge the cultural diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait people Islander people. We celebrate the continuous living cultures of First Australians and acknowledge the important contributions Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have and continue to make in Australian society. We respect and acknowledge our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, staff, elders and visitors who come from many nations across Australia. And we pay respect to elders past, present and future. And we thank you very much for the welcome to country here. And we're very happy to be part of this discussion. So just to give you a bit of an idea, trip on that, of what I'm going to cover today. So I'm going to talk, obviously, with a little bit of a focus on soils, but I want to talk firstly about fire as disturbance, because my main background is in disturbance ecology. Basically, I've looked at impacts of drought. I work mainly at the Centre for Applied Climate Sciences. We work a lot with seasonal climate forecasting and the impact that that has on rangelands in particular right across northern Australia. We have a number of countries in other international sites as well, but always with that focus on the impact that seasonal variation in climate can have on a whole range of production systems in particular, because that's essentially where we're funded. But as an ecologist, I'm very interested in the relationships that occur between natural systems and agricultural systems as well. I want to talk particularly about right fire and the fire-dependent and fire-tolerant and adapted and fire-sensitive species and ecosystems. So the need to recognise that we're talking about, as Leeton said, systems that are linked to place and linked to a fire history for that place, and the species that occur there are a combination or a response to all of the environmental factors that drive the relationships between species themselves, but also species in their environment as well. And obviously, you might remember the old ad that was oils ain't oils, I think it was. So fires ain't fires. Every fire is a different fire. Fires regimes in particular vary across the landscape in terms of their frequency, season, intensity, and the extent and patchiness of those fires. So we can talk about fire as a single thing, but in fact it's a spectrum of a whole range of different factors that then are driving the responses of those ecosystems and the species within them. I will then go on to talk about fire and the impact on soils, and I'll talk particularly about, well, the three main aspects of that is the chemical and physical and biological components of soils that respond to, and the way in which they respond to fire. But what you'll see from that is that we have a large number of knowledge gaps still in thinking about how fire impacts soils, and there's a lot that we can do there. And as part of that, I think it's really important that we don't have this prescriptive idea about fire management, that we have an adaptive management approach, which is essentially the approach that Indigenous cultures have been using throughout the world, which is observational, and it's about basically looking at what's going on around the landscape, looking at the response of the landscape to particular disturbances, monitoring and evaluating and learning as you go. So, a long introduction, but there you go. That's what we're going to talk about. So, as we know, as an ecological disturbance, fire is a critical factor in the natural disturbance regime of the Australian continent, the Australian vegetation types that occur. It influences the distribution and abundance of populations and the nature and function of ecosystems right across the land. As I've said, fire regime is a catch-all, I suppose, that explains the type, the extent, the season, the intensity and the interval between fires that's typical of a particular region or that's applied these days in slightly different ways under our new interactions with the landscape, I suppose, with all of the land use changes that we've inflicted on the country, in some ways, we might say. It interacts with other processes, so climate, of course, and of course there are species interactions that do respond to all of those different aspects of fire. But that produces and has historically produced the evolutionary communities that we see, so the ecosystems and the ecological communities that sit on the landscape, along with the cultural burning practices that have been used across thousands and thousands of years. So this was a managed landscape always, you know. Within ecosystems, different fire histories then create a mosaic pattern where you might have long unburned areas, but you've also got recently burned areas. And as Annabel was saying, there are responses, different responses of different species to those different periods of recovery from fire. Creates diversity. So, and that diversity is based on the availability of a whole range of different habitat niches, which basically drive, you know, there are species adapted to certain conditions post-fire. So where we've got a diversity of fire regimes, we've also got a diversity of niches, we've got a diversity of habitat and consequently a diversity of species that occur. So that's not just wildlife, it's plants and fungi as well, and a whole range of very small little things, as you'll see, that occur in soils. Okay. And I guess we're all singing from the same songbook, basically, but, you know, post-fire or post any disturbance, what you have is a period of recovery back to some sort of more complex system. So post-disturbance, you get with a disturbance, you get a simplification of an ecosystem, and it takes time for that ecosystem to develop towards something. Historically, before we brought in new species and brought in a whole range of different land management practices, you would assume that that was a pretty much given trajectory, I suppose, from a pioneer or an earlier type of ecosystem, simplified ecosystem, through to a more complex ecosystem as various species develop through that ecosystem. And speaking mostly of plants, but along with that, as Annabel said, there's animal species as well that evolve in terms of their population numbers and importance within communities. And that's the result of all the interactions that occur between the abiotic and the biotic components of those ecosystems. So we do know that that occurs. What we tend to find with altered land use management practices is that this trajectory is not always predictable these days, because we have invasive species, we have a whole range of different management practices that apply, we're intervening at a whole range of levels within here, and sometimes we can set these systems off into alternative states, which may or may not be the managed state that we want. So observation again and monitoring and looking at where things are starting to go wrong is really important in terms of, you know, why we use fire in a landscape, or what we're actually trying to achieve in terms of the characteristics and the qualities of that landscape and what it offers in terms of protection of biodiversity, of carbon sequestration, of a whole range of ecosystem services that might accompany that particular vegetation type or that ecosystem type. Oops. Yeah. I think this one pretty much says mostly the same thing, except I wanted to point out, and you know, I know that you'll all be aware that, and because we've spoken already about rainforests, and which sit on basically the end of this trajectory as fire-sensitive ecosystems. So there are some ecosystems in the landscape that shouldn't burn, that should be protected from fire. But by the same token, there are many landscapes, many ecosystems within our landscape that have evolved with the use of fire and that are adapted and to some extent tolerant of fire. Complicated, you know, ideas or diagrams. So it comes down to that question of the right fire for the particular ecosystem type or the landscape in which you're working. So in southeast Queensland here we have obviously a number of fire-sensitive vegetation types and ecosystems, one of which is semi-evergreen vine thickets and rainforest areas, which probably should be protected from fire rather than burned. A note on the map that the area around Boona used to have quite a number of these. It's now a threatened ecosystem type. There used to be quite extensive areas around Boona. If I've got a pointer, I don't know if I have. No? Which indicates where it still exists, but there was a much larger patch. So that's lost to that ecosystem type. Then again, we do have a whole range of fire-adapted communities. A lot of the eucalypt communities, the paperbark woodlands, grasslands, heathlands are all well adapted to fire. They've had a significant fire history through time, and they have a whole range of species that are adapted, as we've been seeing already. So really, I just want to point out that we need to think about the appropriate fire regimes for the areas in which we're working and the areas that are being burned. And I'm not telling anyone anything they don't know, I'm sure, but it is always important to remember and to know what you're working with. Immediately after fire, as I said, fire intensity or fire severity is a really important factor in determining the outcome of fire in terms of its impact. And Gary's already showed pictures of a more intense fire versus a cooler fire and the impact that can have. So if we have a really intense fire, we have virtually nothing left on the landscape, whereas a cooler fire will leave patches of unburned vegetation. They'll leave charcoal, they'll leave little bits and pieces of timber and stuff that haven't burned. So a much gentler and softer place from which to start that whole successional trajectory of ecosystem redevelopment, I suppose, after fire. And getting onto the soils thing, so I guess again, Western science loves complex diagrams. We all, quite enjoy being able to represent things as models and then to work with them. But it's a way of conceptualising some of the key components within those ecosystems that, and particularly in terms of Western science, we do a lot of measurement and modelling of relationships, and it helps us to understand what's going on. Things that are much more intuitive when you live in the landscape, but as a Western scientist, we're often a step removed. I live on a small farm, and I see a lot of these changes as well, but I'm always wanting to go out and measure them, get some numbers. So, complex. What I wanted to point out is just this bottom bit. So after we've had, a whole range of different fire intensities and the fire severity duration, I think, is sitting in there. You can see ash cover and partial or total plant cover elimination on the top. So they're relatively direct impacts that occur from fire. They have a whole range of impacts from soil microclimate changes, a whole range of other environmental factors then interact with those to result in these post-fire effects, which might be medium or long-term. But a key component of that is what's happening in the soils and how that might be impacting. So I will move on. And I think I've said most of that, so we might just go straight on to the effects on soil chemistry. So immediately after fire, we have either partial or complete burning of organic matter and ash deposition on the soil surface. So those obviously are likely to have chemical reactions with the soil as rain falls on that landscape after time. And that can result in changes in the soil chemistry as a result of those, the mixing of those partially burned organic materials with the soils. But the impacts on soil chemical properties are highly variable and vary with the intensity of the fire. So with low intensity fires, we can have from little change overall to an increase in available nutrients and an increase in pH as well due to ash deposition. It's called the ash bed effect. But with high intensity fires, what we tend to get is an increase in certain concentrations of things with increasing fire intensity, but a decrease in organic matter, and often an increase in soil and in nitrogen loss with combustion and volatilisation of those components. So physical changes. This is a very jumpy little thing. Often soil physical properties are negatively affected by fire, and one of the interesting things about fire is at certain temperatures is that it can create this hydrophobic layer within the soil which can actually impede recovery from recovery post-burning. So that hydrophobic layer is a waxy layer that's derived from plant material as it burns, and the gases infiltrate into the soil and coat the soil particles, and they can basically then impede water movement through the soil and the growth of roots and things as well. So, and fungal hyphae as well that might move through the soil. So that's a particularly problematic thing. It does break down over time, but it can actually, anecdotally, I've had people say to me, I'm sure that's why the soils on my dad's place have never really recovered from that particular fire that we had, X number of years ago. So that's an interesting and important result of burning under a whole range of... The soil, we'll go on to soil biology. So when we talk about soil biology, it's there's a whole world underneath or in the soil that we don't see when we're walking around, but is really critical to the recovery of soil. So those microbiomes can either create or break down that hydrophobic layer. They help plants to access nutrients. They help with soil or moisture infiltration to the soils. They're really important, and there's a whole little world that goes on down there that we really don't see at the scale that we look at things. That whole microbiome is generally negatively affected by fire. So it can suffer from direct impacts due to generated heat from fire, and many of those organisms are completely killed at soil temperatures above 120 degrees. And as we'll see in the next slide, that's not anywhere near the full range of temperatures that you get with a lot of fires. They're also impacted indirectly by fire-altered soil chemical and physical properties that we spoke about earlier. So, So here we have, I was glad I found this diagram, so because I think it just captures things. It says, like, in the green we've got the biological impacts, in the bluey purple it's the chemical impacts, and in the orange and yellow it's the physical impacts. And you can see across the range of temperatures that are experienced from cool burning right through to intense wildfire, the impacts. And you can see with cool burning that soil microbiology is impacted at relatively low temperatures, which is interesting and potentially concerning, except if you do cool season burning, then you've got, as Garry showed, those little islands of unburned vegetation, and underneath those you've essentially got a whole community of soil biota that have not been impacted to any large extent, we would assume, by fire. So I think that's a really interesting thing. And so those little patches, apart from the fact that you're not creating those really intense changes that occur in the chemistry and the physical components of the soils, those little patches offer an opportunity for reseeding and, re-infiltrating and more rapid recovery of those ecosystems. So, and I will stop. Soil biota do a lot of things. I've probably already said most of that. They play a critical role. We're still trying to understand a lot of what they do. I said they can be really helpful in terms of recovery from hydrophobic soils. That's interesting. They can act as facilitators and actually, what are they calling it? The helper effect, the mycorrhizal helper effect. So proposed, and these are all recent publications, so there's a lot that we don't know intense, there are lots of debates about wildfire, but in actual fact there's quite a lot of research on the impacts to wildfire. We don't have a lot of research and understanding of what happens in terms of these gentler fires that we're talking about that are much, well, we know that they're kinder to the landscape, but there's a lot that, you know, of questions that we could ask and answer in relation to that to back up the Indigenous approach to managing fire within the landscape. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Many questions that gets scientists happy and excited. But the key thing I really wanted to say is down the bottom, that we need to have this adaptive mindset when we're managing fire in the landscape. And that really is, rather than prescriptive, where we go, we need, as we saw with the regional ecosystem management guidelines for burning, that there are prescribed burning frequencies and intensities with those fires or those ecosystems. What we need to do is also be, or rather, be adaptive in our mindset and observational, trialling and testing hypotheses, monitoring and measuring and learning from the landscape and the management practices. That'll do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another big round of applause for Dr. Reardon-Smith. Our final speaker is the Principal Scientist for the Bushfire Resilience in Healthy Land and Waters Climate Adaptation Team. Dr. Diana Virkki is an expert at providing tailored best practice outcomes that promote ecological and cultural values for resilient landscapes and communities. Everybody, a big round of applause for Diana.
Okay, hello everyone. So my name is Diana Virkki. I'm a Principal Scientist at Healthy Land and Water, as Germaine said. And specifically I work within a group called the Queensland Fire and Biodiversity Consortium, which I'm going to refer to as a QFBCE from now on because it's a giant mouthful. And so my background is in fire ecology. I had a research background, did my PhD on the effects of different fire regimes on reptiles and small mammals. And after this, I worked in a private consultancy where I worked as a fire practitioner and fire planner all across Australia and did a lot of work in southeast Queensland. So I've got a bit of a mixed background, and most recently at the QFBC, I've been working here for, sorry, get closer to the microphone, working with the QFBC for about a year now, more working in community engagement and other fire planning. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is collaborative fire management, collaboration in fire management. So I'm going to talk through some of the planning tools that we use currently and some of the observations I've seen through the landscape in planned burns as well as wildfire. Hopefully you're not all scienced out, and I've tried to reduce the amount of graphs I've got in my talk. So thanks for bearing with us all, and let's get through it. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the country in which we meet today. Thank you so much to the Yugara people for the really lovely welcome to country, and it is really an honour and a privilege to be standing here presenting to you all with this great board of presenters as well. So yeah, I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that continuous connection to country and association with fire in the landscape that has brought our landscapes to where they are today. So I put up a quote here from one of the world-renowned fire ecologists, and this isn't meant to scare you. What he said was understanding, oh, the screen's not on. I see why people have been leaning across. Understanding fire isn't rocket science, it's much more harder than that. And it can be really complex, and you've seen that through the talks we've seen tonight, but it doesn't have to be, and hopefully this talk can try to break some of those complexities down, as well as with our questions in the panel after this. So we know why fire is important in the landscape, why it's an issue currently, so I won't dwell on this, But something I did want to point out is that the majority of bushland in Queensland is privately owned. So 93% of our bushland is on private property, which means that private landholders play a massively critical role in managing or protecting our native biodiversity and bushland, but also managing that bushfire risk. Also, I wanted to point out that in recent years there's been a real massive increase in the recognition of importance of Indigenous fire practices, and we're coming a long way in starting to integrate that into the way we manage the country. So how do we effectively engage in fire management? We need to recognise that all different people have different experiences with fire and different knowledge levels, so being respectful and acknowledging of that. And tenure-blind collaboration is really, really important. So, as we know, fires don't stop at a fence line. They don't look at boundaries. And we need to think about fire in that context as well. That fire is going to move across the landscape. So a landscape approach to fire management is really important. Working with your First Nations groups, public, private and industry, and working together across the landscape. We need to be able to tailor our services to the needs of each specific area. As Leeton was talking about, each specific area is unique and how fire interacts there. It's not a one-size-fits-all for fire, for planning or implementation. And we need to facilitate balance in how we manage fire. So we know that as an ecologist, I'm here to protect the environment and cultural heritage, but also all of us have important values in the landscape. We have our houses in the landscape. We have people out there, and we need to balance that in the way we manage things. Through some of our planning workshops that we run at the QFBC, we've really seen that it's a lack of knowledge that affects people's ability to implement any bushfire mitigation on their properties. So this includes planned burning or any other mitigation. So that just highlights how important evenings like this are, and it's really amazing to see such a huge turnout for everyone here to share knowledge and hear stories about how to manage for fire. So the first case study I wanted to talk about is the subcatchment fire management planning tool that we use, and as an example we've been applying this in an area really close to here, so at Rosevale to Rome, and that's shown in the map here. So this is a collaborative approach to fire management across the landscape, looking at the landscape from a tenure-blind approach, and we work really closely with all of the key stakeholders, so your Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, Queensland Parks and Wildlife, Department of Resources, Council and traditional owners. So through this works, specifically at Rosevale to Rome, with a huge input from the local fire brigades, we've been able to identify a 42-kilometre fire trail that we've connected across the landscape to be able to protect those private landholder properties, as well as the World Heritage Area in Main Range National Park adjoining them. So this has been a really great initiative, and we're currently working through implementing works across this landscape. So prior to the works that went ahead, we had cultural heritage inductions done with all the private landholders and contractors, and pre-works cultural heritage surveys done in high-risk areas. So this work was done closely with the Yugara Dancers people. Ooh, too far. So this planning tool is the Township Fire Management Strategy, and this was developed by the Quandamooka Yulabarabi Aboriginal Corporation initially on Minjerribah, which is North Stradbroke Island. And as a consultant, I was really privileged to be able to work very closely with Quandamooka in developing this planning tool. So the idea behind the TFMS, I'll call it, is that it's really underpinned by cultural values and cultural knowledge, and cultural values are protected in the landscape equally as importantly as community buildings and assets, as well as environmental values. So the process initially begins with a traditional knowledge gathering exercise, and that body of knowledge sits with the Quandamooka people. It's theirs to own and keep, and it doesn't go in the public document. And then using that knowledge, we build out a planning tool that fits within the current contemporary legislative framework and is accepted by all landholders and land managers across the region. So this, again, is a really collaborative tenure-blind approach, looking at the landscape the way fire would, really. So we had on board QFES and QPWS, DOR, and the local councils. And through this work, we've identified, we identify specific fire management zones across the landscape and how they'll be managed within those. So the map showing all the colours is showing all the different fire management zones, and within those you've got specific prescriptions on how to manage those. This work's is currently rolling out across Minjarrabah, so they've inputted a series of priority fire trails and breaks in the landscape, and this has enabled landscape management of Quandamooka using cultural fire in the broader landscape areas. So really it's focused around townships in an urban context, but enables that cultural fire practice across the landscape. What else am I going to say? So through working through this process, walking on country with the project team and the Quandamooka people, they were able to recognise evidence of decades and thousands of years of historical fire management through the species that existed and coexisted in the landscape. So for example, these old cypress trees, they coexist with blue gums, large old blue gum trees in the landscape, which wouldn't coexist without fire management. And some of these trees were aged to be over 1,500 years old, so they're quite significant trees in the landscape. And some of the aerial imagery we used, so looking back 1955, on the left-hand side, this is a swamp on Minjarrabah, or wetland. You can see that the circled areas have really thickened in vegetation up to 2012 through a change in fire regimes and a lack of fire in that landscape, as well as an input of after fires were removed from that landscape, there was a series of wildfires that occurred across that landscape, which ended up thickening tea trees, which have started to clog up some of the wetland areas and caused a higher fire risk. So through this works, what Quandamooka were identifying were what their historical vegetation structures should be like, and they're working towards reinstating that type of vegetation structure, which is really a lower risk vegetation type. So we know what happens when we do nothing with no fire management. This is the wildfire that occurred on Minjarrabah in 2014. So it burnt some 70% of the island. And as you can see on the right-hand side, all of the large old dead trees, which are quite significant in the landscape, as Leeton was talking about, the old trees play a really important cultural role for Quandamooka on this island. They're all lost in the landscape, and the revegetation, the thickening that's occurring is really causing an increase in bushfire risk, which repeats that cycle of wildfires. So it's basically creating an environment that's waiting for another wildfire to occur. And with that repetitive nature of wildfires, with the thickening, it causes more loss of significant trees in the landscape and a loss of habitat. So through this work, the Quandamooka people have been implementing mechanical works as well as using hand tools to reduce some of that thickened vegetation in areas where it shouldn't be, to reduce the risk in significant areas for the people. So that example on the left is showing a cypress camp area. And cypress are quite fire sensitive, so they've been removing shrubby vegetation around cypress areas, and this has enabled them to implement low intensity cultural burns in those areas. So through my consulting work, I was able to run a prescribed burn program in 2020, which was on unallocated state land through southeast Queensland. And the purpose of these burns was hazard reduction, but as a fire ecologist, I had ulterior motives. So I was trying to implement more low intensity low intensity, what do you call that? What I'm trying to say? Ecological burns, essentially, but with that dual benefit of risk reduction. So some of the sites, about six or seven of the burns I undertook were on in eucalypt forest, so open eucalypt forest, and prior to the burns had fuel hazards of high to very high. We implemented low intensity burns with low flame heights and slow moving backing fires using good soil moisture and burning into the wind generally. And these resulted in fuel hazards 2 years after these fires at low to moderate. So we were seeing good regeneration, but none of that thickening of vegetation that you sometimes see with hotter fires. And again, in some coastal heath / woodland forest types. So these were quite really dense, thick, heathy vegetation where you could barely walk through. So we, prior to the burns, they had fuel hazards of very high to extreme, very, very dense. And then we implemented low intensity fires in 2020. This site in particular, using the slope to back the burn down the hill, so keeping the intensity low even though the fuel was quite thick. And then 2 years post-fire, we've had primarily low to moderate fuel hazards. Some of the more weedy sites that were low-lying were at high fuels, but still pretty low in general. So, and at one of these sites, we, about 15 months post-fire, we had a resprouting event of endangered Christmas bells. There was, I think council counted 137 individuals, which was really exciting. Because this site was really, really long unburnt. It was I was really happy to see this occur because for me this burn was specifically a logistical nightmare to get going. It had multiple tenures. It was next to an airport. It was next to about 4 ritzy communities that were close to the bush and a highway. So I had almost every direction had something that I had to not blow smoke on. So it was really quite difficult, and I had a lot of difficulty getting fire permits for this burn. But we got it going, and yeah, great outcomes, so that was really nice. And the flowers are pretty too. So some wildfire impacts that I've noticed in the landscape. So working with Quandamooka again, we have been developing township fire management strategies on Mulgumpin, which is Moreton Island. And through this, we did some vegetation transects comparing frequently burnt wildfire mitigation zones with an area that was impacted by a wildfire in 2019, which was a really large-scale wildfire. So as you can see, some of the sapling regeneration was sapling counts significantly lower in the frequently burnt area compared to the wildfire. So that's a frequently burnt site showing nice open forest, and the wildfire area, which is quite thick in vegetation, and it's obviously a higher bushfire hazard at this point. So what is the solution? We need to prioritise healthy country, so triaging the landscape and looking at those areas that we can burn easily and nicely and work out from there, using landscape indicators such as kangaroo grass in open forests. We really do need more frequent low intensity fire across the landscape, and a key part of this is implementing more cultural burning in the landscape. This is considering good soil moisture, and frequent fire is really needed in the landscape to be able to maintain those native grasses that enable burning under moister conditions when it's early, where you're not going to lose those large trees and habitat features or cultural features in the landscape. We need to be nimble when we burn, so burning to conditions, not deadlines. As a contractor, that's difficult a lot of the time, and a lot of contractors are trying to get out there and get their burns done, as well as land managers, but we need to broaden the windows of burning, burning after storms, using nighttime burning as an option if the temperatures are higher, and looking at a landscape approach rather than focusing on assets, because looking at the landscape as a broader picture is really going to be able to reduce that risk at a landscape scale, and considering those ecological and cultural assets when we do our fire management. So when we're talking about recovering from wildfire, this is going to be a key issue across southeast and the whole east coast of Australia in coming years. What do we do there? So we have Quandamooka people on Minjerribah have been able to implement a prescribed burn in a really thickened vegetation area post the 2014 wildfire. So up the top we have an image that was taken 2 years after the fire, so really thick vegetation, and then they implemented a burn, when was that one, sorry? I think it says it down there, but I can't read. So it implemented a burn in 2018, and this was a low intensity fire. It started to break up that fuel. There's still fallen timber present, but good regrowth. Obviously, changing a landscape from what it used to be and it turning into this dense thicket is a long-term process, and you can't just solve that with one fire. So it's going to be a continued process of re-implementing appropriate fire regimes to get those responses. So what does that mean for you? You should be, if you're wanting to implement fire across the landscape, we all should be engaging with the local First Nations groups, as Leeton was saying. We need to be cognizant of the changed landscapes that exist currently. We've got fences, property boundaries, we've got a lot of assets in the landscape, people's houses, and the vegetation has really changed, specifically from a lack of fire, and then also because of wildfires that have occurred in that landscape that have thickened the vegetation. So we need to really think about that when we're planning for burns and how that would, how they interact. Collaboration is critical, so working with your neighbours, working with all the stakeholders around you, so you can consider fire and how your piece of property fits in that broader landscape. Get to know your conditions and get to know your country. Walk around and see what it looks like at different times of year, how long it takes for certain areas to dry out, so you can burn areas with the right soil moisture and that kind of thing. Infrastructure is important in terms of what fire trails and brakes you might need when you're burning. If you need these, you might not need a fire trail if you're implementing a low intensity fire, but that really depends on what fire risk is on your property, what vegetation types you have, and slopes and that kind of thing. And preparation, so preparing your assets, infrastructure, and making sure that you have appropriate communications before burning. And a permit to light is critically important, of course. This needs to be done by the landholder. And yeah, every burn that's over 2 by 2 metres needs a permit to light. I've just put an example of a permit up here because I just wanted to show you some of the things that we need to include in these. So they'll ask what your resources are that you're having, what fire trails and brakes are in place, and that you've notified all your neighbours. So there's a few issues that we need to, there's a few issues we need to cross before we are able to really implement really perfect broad-scale fire management across the landscape. And the first one is obviously funding. It's difficult to pay for this kind of stuff. There's a lot of funding out there currently from post-disaster management funding, I guess, and it's good to just capitalise on that and get things going in the landscape. Access to country is an issue for First Nations people specifically. As I mentioned, a lot of private land covers native bushland, so that creates issues there. Knowledge sharing, it's really great that everyone's here learning and sharing knowledge, so these types of nights are really important. Re-education of what appropriate fire in the landscape looks like. I've written the culture of people who make decisions about land management, which might be a bit pointy. There's some old school views on how we should burn, and a lot of people used to say, make it black, don't come back. And that still happens in the landscape. This is definitely changing, but it's still an education piece in what appropriate fire looks like in the landscape. People who play a critical role in that is the RFS and fire wardens. They're the ones that are going to sign off on your permits. There's a lot of culture change through RFS, which is really great to see. So get to know your fire wardens and build that trust, because if they don't trust you, then they probably won't sign off a permit that has no fire breaks on it, for example. I think I might leave it there. This is just saying that adaptive management is important, and with the changing climate, we need to really be more resilient. Cool, I'll leave it there.
Thank you again. Big round of applause to Dr. Diana Virkki. So wow, what an awesome amount of knowledge that we've had bestowed upon us. So if you're like me and you've had a lot of knowledge bestowed upon you and a lot of thought going on, save those questions up. We're going to have a short intermittent break.
Okay, could we start with you? Could you tell us your name and the organisation that you're with?
Yep, so I'm Lynda Maybanks. I'm the Managing Director of Wirrinyah First Nations Conservation Services.
And can you tell us something about Wirrinyah?
Yep, so we're a First Nations conservation land management business based here on Yugara country, and we provide weed management, revegetation and cultural burning services to the wider community.
Okay, and what was your motivation for coming here tonight?
Well, obviously, because our business is reviving cultural burning and starting to provide it as a service out to community, it's really important that our community, have opportunity to learn more about cultural burning, and especially in the Western context as well, because we've been fighting to kind of revive this knowledge for so long, but finally seeing how the Western science is supporting that too is really beneficial, and it's a really good step in the right direction for the type of work that we do.
Right. There was a lot of information there tonight. Is there anything in particular that stuck out for you?
I think obviously with cultural burning, we use our cultural knowledge, and but seeing it actually being presented in a Western context, we know that it is beneficial to country, but seeing it actually on a graph, it almost is really, it just gives you that reassurance almost. But I mean, the whole session's been really great, and it's been a really good way to just reiterate how important cultural burning is.
Right. Thanks very much, Lynda.
Thank you.
Hi. Can you start by telling us your name and the organisation that you're from?
I'm Pamela Greet, and my consultancy is called Future Ag Queensland, but I'm also a member of Boona and District Landcare.
And what was your motivation in coming here tonight?
Tonight, I guess I was really keen to see what people had to say about fire management in the context here, and really that intersection between the traditional knowledge and understanding of the use of fire and how that may or may not intersect with, I guess, what we call Western science.
So what did you find out about that intersection tonight?
For me, I think that having Leeton up first was really important, because that really emphasised the interrelationship or the indivisibility between the people and the landscape and the kind of cultural beliefs. And so it was interesting then to hear, I guess, the approaches from the 4 different Western sciences, each of them really informed by their different kind of backgrounds. So I found that very interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Can we start by telling us your name and what motivated you to come here tonight?
My name's Ian from Barney View. Now, inappropriate burning off is a visceral issue for me, and I can bear witness to what the scientists say. We have a nature refuge next to Mount Barney National Park, and in late fire season 2020, a grazier next to the park decided to burn off. Right next to the park there's a grass fire, and he decided to burn. He had a permit. He decided to burn despite there being a westerly front. Now, there were hundreds of hectares of the park burnt, countless dominant trees along the ridge lines were felled. And of course it burned out our nature refuge. There were, I can't count how many animals were killed, but I found a burnt carcass of a koala and a brush-tailed rock wallaby, which broke my heart. Now for 7 months up on the mountain, no grass would grow. Even despite rain, the soil was burnt and dead. We spent hundreds of hours back-breaking work carting food and water up to the peak so the brush-tailed rock wallabies could survive, and hundreds of hours replanting trees. Now, to add insult to injury, when the rains did come in abundance, the weeds, the lantana and the acacias that Garry and Leeton have described came back in earnest, and it's everywhere. There's a firebomb up there waiting for the next fire. Now, to make it worse, I obtained the documents from National Parks and RTI, and they had 3 different legal ways of stopping the grazier from lighting up, and for reasons best known to them, they decided to help him, and the fire lit up and spread into the national park anyway. Now, the fire was just a disaster because there's more stuff on the ground than there was before. Dead trees, branches, leaves, as well as all these weeds that have grown up. The fire was totally counterproductive. Now, I've been through Landcare to Leeton Lee's training, cultural burning training, and I personally am confident that if they'd done an early season fire, a cool burn of the type that Fire Sticks Alliance advocates, the farmer could have had his burn, and the national park would still be there, the trees would still be upright, and the habitat wouldn't have been burnt out.
So it really speaks to the need for collaboration.
Yes, collaboration, yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Alison.
Hi, could you start by sharing your name and the organisation that you come from, please?
Wal Mayr. I represent 2 organisations. I'm president of Watergum, which is an overarching group, and an individual land care group called Austinville Land Care.
Okay. And what was your motivation in coming here tonight?
Austinville Land Care won a $250,000 grant to reconstruct fire trails, and through that process, I realised that. Even before that, we're sort of heading to the pyrocene, a combination of bad management, longer El Niños, poor management, lack of cooperation. We're heading for a situation where 2019 is going to become more frequent. And we need, as everyone said today, we need to collaborate, we need to get that knowledge. So, it'd be a tragedy if we laid waste to our landscape before we started learning. So nights like this, and Lynda and the Landcare group have done such an amazing job of getting the community together, educating, and trying to avoid that catastrophic situation where everything just goes up in smoke. So I just commend, and I came here to learn. So just the more we can learn, the more we can avoid the very high probability of real problems.
There was a lot of information here tonight. What is standing out for you? What's something in particular?
It just reinforces a lot, but Leeton's wisdom, they've just beautifully said it. The irony is he communicated in his language what the scientists communicate in theirs, and they were very closely aligned, but and spoken in very different ways. The need to become part of the landscape again, the need to make it part of our culture, to manage land, the need to do this, and the need to get out. One of the biggest impediments I see is risk-averse middle bureaucrats. They're not going to get a promotion if there's a disaster. They say no to everything. unfortunately, we've got to embrace a little bit of risk and do stuff. Otherwise, we're going to have a catastrophic situation. So, I just everything I saw today. The ecologist, I forget her name, from Gatton was just amazing. Liked her work. It heartened me to hear that the regional ecosystem guidelines, you know, there's something, but gee, we've got to make them better, and we've got to get the whole community involved in implementing them. Like, it's when, as a community, as a society, we're not there yet. And again, I emphasise this is part of the process. We need hundreds of these across Australia, getting people the message to start getting fire management, land management, love of country as part of our culture.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you
Thanks.
very much.
Thanks.
There's always one holding us up. No. All right, thank you. So hopefully over the break you've had some time to go over the information that we've had shared tonight, and thought of some questions that you may have that have intrigued you through the presentations. You'll notice we'll have some people standing around, so just raise your hand and stand, and one of the people with the microphones will come and you can ask away to our lovely guests. So to the floor we go. Who has a question ready to go?
It's probably into Leeton to start with. Raymond Stacey, grazier and grazing consultant. Okay, it's that really heavy burn Millmerran, the way back into recovery there, and to do it at scale. Okay, so you've got that very thick undergrowth, very thick growth coming. How do you manage that?
One of the big issues with, I guess, the area out that way, as in a lot of places that have seen fire or the absence of fire for a long time, is the wrong vegetation. That area has hundreds of kilometres of cypress pine, which has invaded multiple ecosystems and dominated, which has killed all the grasses and just created a really, really highly volatile landscape. One of the big things with that is you can't just go in and burn cypress, because we can see what it does is it'll go through and destroy everything. So that's where, working with fire practitioners, you really need to actually start doing some manual stuff as well. So it's not all about fire managing country, it's about actually getting people back out on country, understanding that cultural landscape and what that place should look like, and then being able to actually go in, do some of the manual work, and then start to get some of the fire stuff in afterwards. But even again, with the wrong vegetation there, has been mentioned a couple of times tonight, the adjusting in windows and conditions and things like that before we can get back to burning country the right time again.
Thank you. Next.
It's a question I want to put to Annabel. You were talking about the causes of inappropriate fire in the environment. I would tend to put at the top of the list politics for two reasons. One is that a lot of inappropriate burning is hazard reduction burning, which is done because of fear which is generated by the media. The politicians respond to it, and the public servants have to do something about it. The other point where politics comes into it is simply the budgets that are allocated for burning and the staff that are available to do the burning, and so you get the situation where there's a program for hazard reductions burns, but the staff is too small, the budget is too small, can't be done this year. Oh shit, we're into the really bad season, we can't burn it. Next year, no. Next year, no. Oh, this year we've got some money, we can do it now. Well, sorry, but it should have been done a long time ago, and you're going to get a bad result now. So politics, to me, from personal experience, is one of the drivers of really bad fire regimes.
Yeah, thanks for that point, Gordon. I absolutely agree with you. And that list that I took, that I showed on that slide, was taken directly from our paper that we published in Science. And I found that quantitative scientists especially are really afraid to talk about politics. And after I did my PhD and when I was living in Ireland, I started to become really interested in politics and how it relates to environmental policy. And I learnt a lot about political systems and economic systems and how that was really at the base of a lot of our problems. And I felt really ripped off, because I'd spent all this time studying science to kind of, I started like wanting to change the world, and I was like, wow, science is not going to change the world, damn. And I realised, we don't talk enough about this. I think it should actually be integrated into our scientific education to have more education around political systems and economic systems, because these also link environmental problems to social problems. So I get a little bit frustrated when environmental scientists talk about environmental problems without that political lens, without understanding how if we do things that are good for people, they're often going to be good for the environment as well. So absolutely, I agree with you. And if I was writing that paper for a different audience, I probably would have put politics at the top of the list as well. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
I'd just like to come.
Close.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment a bit further on that. I think one of the problems that has happened with we white Australians managing Australia is for too long we think we'll conserve a bit of bush by just locking it up and it'll just be fine by itself. And the budgets matched that with very little money for land management. But having worked with Aboriginal people in Arnhem Land, where the land was intensively managed, the people knew every square inch of it, they lived in it, and were using it while standing in it, which means they couldn't have wildfires or they'd all be killed. They had to intimately know fire and manage fire while actually standing and walking and having their children within the same landscape that they're burning. And there's no way in the wide world that our natural lands or semi-natural lands are being managed with anything remotely resembling that intensity of effort and intimacy of knowledge of the country. But we need to. We need to rebuild Indigenous connection with land in southern Australia, and as white people in this land, we need to build an intimacy of knowledge of the landscape, and the funding needs to match that to be able to manage the land well, or we're going to have, we're at a time of frighteningly changing climate and rapidly cycling extremes, and the land management issues we're going to be facing are going to be deeply disturbing. There's going to be parts of the landscape that people are going to have to move out of due to floods or fire or drought or these sorts of things happening. And it's all going to hit us in the face, the fact that we've got how to manage land very, very wrong over the past century or so as white rulers of this continent. And we found that out 4 years ago with the fires, and then in the recent few years with all the floods. And sadly, it's going to keep getting worse.
So if I can just tap onto the back of that. The landscape has always been our economy. you couldn't go to somebody's country and try and get a wife if you had no food on your country. So people have always managed it that way. Nowadays we have people who are responsible for fire management on country, but often what's happening is, as was said before, the investment's not there. So it's like asking a builder to build your house and only give him half his tools. What sort of a house are we going to get? I think there does need to be significant investment in supporting traditional owner groups in their regions who can then work with national parks, RFS, councils, private property owners, and really get each region, not just fire ready, but getting the landscape healthy again. And through all that working together, it actually builds relationships and brings people together, and we start talking about the good things about our landscape, not the things that we're worried about. We're worried we're going to get flooded in, or we're worried that we're going to get burnt, and we start talking about a lot more of the positive things.
Hi, my question. Firstly, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. It's been wonderful. So my question is, as if you're a landowner, what is the best way moving forward now? So do we, have the soil analysed first, and then the flora, and then the fauna, and then, Leeton, or do we go Leeton? And, what's the way forward for to start now? If I wanted to start tomorrow, what's the first step in moving forward with this?
Our first step from an Indigenous perspective is just building up the capacity and getting the people out there ready and doing this work. Across southern Queensland, we have quite a large network of people who are undertaking mentoring and work with us at the moment, and some of those people are out there doing this stuff on their own. So the first step, I would say, is to always connect in with the traditional owners and get them to, because a lot of the fire, when we're talking about cultural fire, it's very, very relevant to the local people too, because a lot of their story and connection and understanding of country itself is very specific to that place as well. But yeah, linking in with groups like Land Care, who are doing some amazing stuff, and actually finding, one of the things that I see there is a lack of at the moment is, again, it comes back to that investment. How does either local councils or local government actually make some of this work available for private property owners to be able to pay for fee-for-service work and things like that as they would any other contractor? So it's that investment, but just connecting in with the community and I guess building a bit of momentum. We can't necessarily directly talk to the people at the top from a local level, but on a local level there can be a lot that can be done with many people.
If I could contribute a bit there. I'm new to living in southeast Queensland, but driving around this region, Scenic Rim region in the last week, it's pretty obvious to me that there's a huge diversity in the natural or semi-natural landscapes. Some of them are shockingly weed infested. Some of them are beautiful kangaroo grass sitting under very healthy eucalypts, even if they have been burned. Some of them are very shrubby. Some have got rainforest coming in under eucalypts. Some of them are, the rainforest has been pushed back by fire. Yeah, there's all manner of things going on. Some of them have got one major neighbour. Some bits of bush have got 20 different neighbours. So trying to think of this from a public policy point of view, you've got a huge complexity, so there's not going to be any one answer that does everybody, or even does many people at all. And we've got to have a landscape management system that is sufficiently adaptable to meet people at where they are. What are their priorities in managing this bit of land? Are they particularly interested in some particular plant species or animal species that lives there? Do they really have a major weed problem that they've got to deal with before they can do anything else? Do they have expensive infrastructure either on their property or on their neighbours that really takes top priority over everything else? And they're questions that, individual landholders need to think about themselves. What is their priority, and what should their priority be? And then we as scientists, policy people, fire service people, whoever, need to be able to support them to implement whatever's the appropriate land management to deal with those priority issues. And it's complex, and there won't be simple answers that work for everybody all of the time. And I would think, as we're learning, many times we're going to be getting it wrong.
Can I just add to, is that working? Yep. Understand what the vegetation types are on your property and have an understanding of the species that are there, and understand how they might respond to fire. We spoke about fire sensitive and fire adapted communities, so you do need to understand what the vegetation type for your particular area is, and which species are there that may be invasive, which species are there that need to be, as Leeton said, you need to understand the particular animals and plants that are typical of, or characteristic of that location, but what their response to fire might be and how important they are within that particular landscape. So understanding your land is a start, being observant and getting advice from people who know.
Yeah, just to add to that, some of the information you can get online that Annabel was talking about in her talk shows you what species and vegetation communities you have on your property and provides a guideline. It is just a guideline, as Annabel was talking through, but there is a guide-ish around what fire management practices you can do on your property. And just to do a self-indulgent spruik quietly, we run, at the QFBC, we run property fire management planning workshops. So we do those for most of the local councils in SEQ, and we have a Scenic Rim one coming up as well, where we work through a workbook for your individual property and go through your vegetation types, what your priorities are on your property, and map that out with you. So that's something that you can get in touch with us to attend as well, if you're interested.
Hello, I'm Richard from Wild Mountains, south of Rathdowney, up in the mountains, and I've got a property that's quite tricky to burn, as Leeton knows, he's been up there. Steep ridges, open eucalypt, rainforest on the other side. My understanding is that, from what I read of Victor's book, that you probably burn when it can only just burn, and then that fire will then go as far as it will go, and then it'll probably hit some vegetation that won't burn, or a gully or whatever, and then sometime later you probably come back and light that, and then that won't go back into the area you've burnt because it's all green grass, which is fine, but it seems like that's an enormous amount of work, which, again, once upon a time, Leeton, you were invested in it because it was everything to you, your food, your medicine, your everything. So that takes an inordinate amount of time to do. So I'm thinking that we've got, hopefully, a lot of Indigenous people being skilled up in doing all of this stuff, which is great. But given that, I think, Diana, you said that 93% of the forest that we're talking about is actually in private land, what changes in that culture that you were mentioning? The culture needs to be changed, not only in QFES but in government. Do you see any evidence that that culture is changing, or any plans to engage with these bodies to go, hold on, we've got a lot of private land that needs burning here. We've got our parks, of course, now, our public land, but we've got our private land, and most people aren't going to be able to fund that, I suspect, given the amount of time that it's going to require to actually do it properly, rather than just lighting a match and seeing 1,000 acres go right across the ranges. If we want to do this sensitively, it takes an enormous amount of time. So is there evidence or are there plans afoot that any of you know of to engage government and councils to go, we've got to start putting a lot of money into this and changing the way we do things if we're going to do it the way we want to do it?
If I can just add a further difficulty to what you've just stated, I went to a talk a few years ago that rural Australia Australia generally has an ageing population. Rural Australia especially has an ageing population. So not only is it hard, people out in country areas are getting older. So the people trying to do this land management are getting increasingly unable to do it because of their age. So
I can certainly speak for the Eastern Downs, the other side of the range. Condamine Headwaters Landcare Group has done a lot of burning workshops with fire law, I think. They're another group, I think. Yeah. So there's certainly been a lot of interest from private landholders there. And they're not big properties, so you've got to manage what's happening in terms of infrastructure and neighbours and all sorts of things. But I think there is a lot of interest there within the grazing community in particular. I wouldn't say the cropping people have any interest in it at all. They don't want to see fire on their places. But certainly the grazing industry on the Eastern Downs are really interested. I'm chair of Cambodia Landcare Group. We've got a lot of community interest there as well, a little bit less because we've got more cropping land in our area, but we work closely with groups like Wal Mayr and also the Condamine Headwaters group, so we're well aware of the interest that's out there within the grazing community at least. So. Sorry.
Oh, that's all right. You go.
Yeah, there are a lot of considerations when you're talking about, the time that it does take. One of the things that's always important to consider too is that the first fire is always going to be the hardest fire because of the changes or the build-up and things like that in the vegetation. As far as, I guess, some of those relationship building and things like that with government agencies, there's still a long way to go. There are things that have sort of happened along in the space, but it's not currently designed for the community. It's more designed for an agency perspective. So I know, we have had some conversations, with these agencies and things like that, and that's going to take time, like any relationship. But yeah, those different areas have different considerations. So obviously your terrain, where you have to keep it in a property if your neighbour doesn't want to burn. If your neighbour wants to burn as well, fantastic, because the fire will go where the fire needs to go. And over time, what we really want to be able to see is that, we're building up the resilient landscapes that will only burn at certain times of the year. So you can get an arsonist out with a drip torch and they can't get it to burn unless it's ready to burn. And that's part of that resilience of having healthy country. But yeah, you're right, it does take a bit of initial time, and that was something that it's going to have to get worked towards in certain places.
Yeah, I'll just second that. It is definitely a slow process. For example, the native title laws came in place decades ago, and we're only now seeing more cultural burning across the landscape. And the works that I was involved with on Minjerribah Bar took, I think they got their native title in 2011, and only recently they've been able to put in prescribed burns on country. So it's definitely a slow process, but there's definitely a shift in the culture, and as everyone's been saying, there's more and more interest, particularly as you can see this large crowd here. but it just takes time. And particularly there's been great shifts in RFS and the way that they operate, and they've got Indigenous bushfire officers, one sitting over there, in each region now, so there's been a lot of work towards this space. But I think you mentioned funding as well, which is a massive issue when it comes to this, because when it comes to the end of the day, trying to get fires on the ground, funding always ends up being the roadblocker. Getting access to that is tricky, and unfortunately for the space that we work in, a lot of funding gets injected when there's a natural disaster. So currently there's a lot of funding out there for what we do, which is why we're able to do events like this now, but politics comes into play and people forget after a few years, and then they vote in the next person and there's no more funding. And we noticed this after Black Saturday in Victoria. There was a lot of funding for a few years, and then all the fire science dropped off again. So it's very cyclical, and it's very, very related to politics.
I was just thinking as well that something that needs to happen in that culture shift that you mentioned was really interesting what you were saying, Leeton, about how the land is your economy. And I think that we all need to realise that, because for us it might seem like a lot of work, but when you understand that a healthy landscape means healthy people, maybe if everybody understood that more broadly, it wouldn't seem like as much hard, long work. I mean, after the floods, lettuces were $6 and people were complaining about it, but I didn't see a lot of, there's not a lot of link often with where our food is coming from, and it's coming from the land. And I think we really need to understand that our livelihoods depend on that land. We all need to understand that, I think, and that's got to be part of the culture shift.
Are there many people here who are gardeners and grow your own veggies? Do you spend much time in your garden? Pulling out weeds and making sure you know what's not growing where it shouldn't be growing? It's very much the same thing. But I think it's also important to understand that the whole native title process is something that gets thrown into things, and people, at the end of the day, people know who they are and where they're from, and we don't need paper to allow us to practice our culture that we've been practicing for thousands of years. It's something I've always steered well clear of. But I think ultimately, if it's good for the land, that has to come first. I've been hearing that a lot lately. I just spent some time with the butler, and they say that a lot. If it's good for the land, it must come first. And it's something that really resonates with me. But yeah, that's, I guess, one of the things that starts to cloud the picture is where people, or governments, are requiring pieces of paper to be able to do things that we never needed to do 20, 30 years ago. So I think that can be a really, really tricky space, and that's where a lot of that bureaucracy can start getting in the way of actually getting things done. And before you know it, it's like a lot of what was mentioned before about the excuses, we don't have the funding to do it this year, or we don't have the resources. You start getting tangled up in those cycles when, realistically, we just need people. People and good intentions, and things will happen.
Hi, Gary Lindsay, resident of Boona, member of the Tyrone Rural Fire Brigade, been associated with properties along that area bordering Main Range National Park for about 40 years, and have got to know some of those landholders very well. It's my experience watching some of those landholders that they care very passionately about their land. They put a great amount of thought into fire management. They expend an awful lot of money creating a system of fire breaks so that they can manage wildfires or their control burns. I was recently involved in a project with Healthy Land and Water. You may recall Diana showed a map of all the fire breaks, all the tracks between Cunningham's Gap and Rosevale. I mapped most of those, so I know that country very well, and I can confirm that a lot of those graziers and landholders are very adept at assessing just when it's the right time, when soil moisture is right, when pasture moisture is right, the right time of day, the right wind, whether to burn upslope, downslope, whatever. They're also incredibly effective in working as a team, and some of them are here tonight. So we don't just have one person, but we might have 3 or 4 buggies with drip torches and spray rigs so that we can burn a small area, burn it well, burn it cool, control it. So I just want to dispel the misconception, if it's there, that landholders don't care passionately about their land and don't adopt effectively the same principles that we're talking about with cultural burning. And if it's an elephant in the room, I think on the part of a lot of the landholders, they get a little bit cringy when they say, or people say to them, cultural burning is what you've got to do. And they would say, well, our knowledge of our land, our 4, 5, 6,000 acres is intimate. It comes from 3 or 4 generations of family on the land. We know how it reacts to fire. It's in the slopes up against main range. It's different out on the flat. We know our patch. We care for it. We do it properly. So I just want to see if we can work in a joint fashion rather than making it sort of combative. It's not graziers against cultural burning. Many of them are doing cultural burning, but it comes from their own culture, but it's exactly the same principles.
100% agree with what you just said there. That's one thing that hasn't been acknowledged, is those farmers who have been on those properties for generations and generations. They learned that knowledge somewhere, and they've been applying it for many, many years. And because that property has stayed within that family, as that's inherited, so is the knowledge. And this is something that we would like to see happen across more areas. One of the big issues that we're seeing at the moment is when you have people who have moved straight from Brisbane or the Gold Coast or whatever city, they decide that they want to be farmers, they haven't got a clue. And there's a lot of learning and catching up to do. Whilst the intention might be good, there's a lot of stuff that is passed down through generations that needs to be considered. We were discussing this before, that with any sale of a certain size property or anything like that, there should be a condition on that sale that the land management procedures or practices is actually passed over with that land, because there's a lot of knowledge being lost through those sales as well. But yeah, it's definitely, and the same thing for a lot of farmers or graziers and things like that. Where does their livelihood come from? It comes from the land. So the land is going to be the number one focus of what's happening. Are they getting enough water? Are there enough trees? Is there enough grass? All of these things are things that they do, and we are doing some work with Landcare on some agricultural projects, specifically working with cattle farmers in some in some regions. I'll get my words right. And a lot of that is having a look at how to keep back a lot of the invasive species coming through, taking over the grass pastures, making a lot of those lands inaccessible for cattle to actually get into to graze. And the other side of that is having a look at the benefits of the native grasses as well. But yeah, it is definitely a point that hasn't been acknowledged tonight, and I'm glad that you have brought that up, because that is something that's important, and because that is, I guess, from the vision where we work from, that's what we would like to see happen into the future. People can engage with traditional owners for a little while, work out just what that land needs. Property owners can then manage their country and they know what to do. Traditional owners can start working with somebody else. And it's like a fire that spreads. No, that was a bad pun. That was a bad pun. But that is the intention, that we can essentially get each region just working together, and that's what part of that process that brings people together. And I'm sure in a lot of places, you know, that knowledge is also handy to be able to link in with traditional owners and work together to rebuild some of that knowledge base as well in places. But yeah, if I don't be quiet, I'm going to keep talking. So.
I'll just say something. Thank you, Garry, for your comments. So that Roseville Tyrone project wouldn't have gotten anywhere without the dedication and passion of those landholders, and as well as from Garry, who put in a lot of time to pulling that together. So yeah, the collaboration is definitely important across those landholders, and that knowledge that we're a platform to bring all that together into a planning tool. But the landholders already had a lot of that knowledge with them. So thanks, Garry.
I think the other consideration too is the intent of the land use as well, because some people want land to be able to crop, other people want it to be able to restore it or regenerate it, other people want to graze it. So there's all these different considerations that come into play there. But yeah, so it's definitely a lot of considerations to take into account there.
So can I just comment? I just need to comment about what my friend has said. Now, my friend at the back has asserted that landholders are all environmental angels. I'd like to comment on that through bitter personal experience and raise a question mainly for Leeton. Now, my experience was that this grazier at Barney View, he lit up next to the national park, burned out hundreds of hectares. He burned out my property, hundreds of trees fell down. I saw a burnt koala, a burnt brush-tailed rock wallaby, and I spent back-breaking hours replanting, revegetating, and this fellow couldn't give a fig. He left the district once there was a fire. Now, what I'm coming to is that the current legislation is well over 30 years old, it's out of date, it's very pro-landholder. As a retired lawyer, it's got three problems. First, only the immediate neighbour has any rights to even be told about it. So if you happen to be on the other side and in the line of fire, you've got no rights at all. Second problem is, under the RTI legislation, you've got no right to get the fire permits. So it's all secret. The third problem is that if you've got a fire permit, unless you can prove the conditions were breached, the landholder is absolved from any criminal or civil liability. So this fire, there was just a whitewash. They wouldn't prosecute this guy, they wouldn't even give him a ticket. Now, you compare that with the more modern legislation in New South Wales, where there's regional plans, and permits aren't handed out by their friends, the local firewood friends to their mates. There's a regional plan required to meet the region. Now, my question to Leeton is are there any political moves afoot to review this out-of-date legislation?
Not that I'm aware of. I believe that there should be accountability for any fire that's lit that gets out of control. Yeah, that I think people have a right to know where those fires are coming from, because often we just see that, you know, there's a bushfire, but there's no mention of how it actually started, whether it started as a hazard reduction burn or permitted burn or what it was. But yeah, I definitely think there needs to be more accountability, and where a lot of our laws are old, and we're in a new time where we need changes, and we need the laws to accommodate that. Currently they don't reflect a lot of the needs of the land as well, like when it comes to invasive natives, for example, you know, where some things need to be manually removed. You're actually in some places breaking the law by doing it, but it's what the land needs. But yeah, there definitely does need to be a review of some of the legislation and stuff like that.
I might just sit, if that's okay with everyone. A lot of the questions I was going to ask, or my broad question, it's all been answered, so it's pretty awkward because I've been holding onto this mic for a while. But a part of the question I had, and it's really probably for you, Dr. Cook, when you mentioned that a lot of the landholders are ageing, it's a big issue, and they might not be as physically able. But then I think, okay, so what about generational change? Younger people that are coming through with fresher ideas, more open-minded, ways of approaching things possibly. I'm really interested in this space and the role of generational change, or the role that generational change might have in this space. And I suppose my question's probably directed to you, Leeton, all of you, but especially you with what you do. I'm interested in how many young people are getting involved in that. I have a background in education, so I always think about that side of things, and what you're doing sounds absolutely amazing. So yeah, I'd be interested in to hear from all of you, but especially you, Len, in that role generational change has to play in this space.
My youngest daughter's nearly 3. So I do bring my children out to fires, and they come out with me. Community bring out their children to some of the fires that we do. Within the network and the training program that we're running at the moment, we've got quite a large number of younger people. But we also, the same as on the landscape, we need that balance of the elders to help guide them through as well. There is a number of younger people coming through, but we really need to, I guess, start educating in the school system as well. So we are working towards school resources for children, and we need, junior ranger programs and I think that's good opportunities to start having a look at how we invest in our young people, not just to keep them out of youth detention centres, but to instill values, because when we're talking about our natural landscape and our natural law, it also aligns with our law of the people as well. So that those laws intersect and overlap in a lot of the principles. So yeah, there are a lot of young people getting involved, but we always need more. There's a lot of country out there that needs help.
I'm a teacher and I teach young people. They're about 20. They seem really young to me, but I give a lecture actually I use Victor Stephenson's book Fire Country, and I teach them about some of the other things that I've been reading in books by Indigenous people, and always in my feedback the students love that lecture the most. And I'm not Indigenous, so I do my best with the information I have, but I can certainly say that my students really want to know more about this. They're like hungry for this kind of knowledge, so that's really encouraging to see.
Through our fire workshops that we run, we do notice that it is generally an older audience that are interested in coming and learning more and doing that practical fire management on their properties. And I don't know if that's because of time and money or what the difference is. I recently worked in a community at Agnes Waters, and there was a lot of tension between the older community that have lived there for decades and know how to manage their land, and then a lot of Melbourneites or Southerners that have moved up and don't care about managing their property, so they just leave their vegetation, don't do anything on their boundaries, and there ends up being a lot of community tension. So I think there is a lot of education that needs to be done through some of those people that are moving into our more remote areas or rural areas that need land management. And someone said you were talking about having that as part of the land deed. I think that's really critical, and there's a gap that I've noticed in real estate agents even, that they don't tell you you're moving into a bushfire prone area. This is something you need to think about when you have this land, but I think it's really important. So we just need to keep trying to educate and get people to listen and learn. share knowledge.
We'll take one more question.
Yeah, just back onto what's happening in the country. The link between, I think it's to you, Garry, the link between carbon above ground and carbon below. You were measuring the carbon following fires. What was happening below ground?
In open country further west from here, the carbon below ground really reflects what's above ground. The trees are bringing up nutrients from deep in the soil, using that to capture sunlight and taking carbon from the atmosphere and produce wood. And they're doing that below ground as much as they're doing it above ground. So the carbon in a lot of the open country reflects the tree density. And further south out from Canberra in cleared paddocks, people that were cleared over a century ago, you can still see where the trees were by the carbon that's in the soil. And it's due to this nutrient pump action of trees. Certainly, you know, a healthy perennial grassland helps build up carbon in the soil compared to, you know, poorly growing annual grasses or eroded, overgrazed landscapes. But trees and woody shrubs are certainly where it's at in landscapes for where carbon is. Does that answer your question? Yeah. You know, you can often see in, you know, open dry country further west, underneath the, or in the shadow of the trees, you'll get kangaroo grass growing, whereas further out away from the trees, it switches first of all to black spear grass, then out to the wire grasses, further out as the nutrients get poorer. The trees are shading the soil so it's not so hot in these places, and pumping the nutrients into them. And that's where the carbon is.
Thank you. My name's Lynda Kimber. I'm the President of Boonah and District Landcare, and on behalf of Boonah and District Landcare, I'm so incredibly proud of this event that we've put on tonight, and very, very grateful to all of our presenters.
No, you need to tell me how I'm going to explain this to my wife. Thank you.